Hello everyone. I know you used this video to fall asleep, but before you do, let me know where you're from and what time you're watching. Now just get cozy and enjoy. I never thought I'd discover something like this. I became a marine biologist because I love the ocean, the calmness of it, the way it hides so many secrets. But some secrets, some things should stay hidden. It all started when we found the trench. We were on a routine research trip, mapping sections of the seafloor that hadn't been charted yet. It was supposed to be a straightforward mission: send down a submersible, gather some samples, and analyze the data. But when we came across the trench, everything changed. It was massive, wider than anything I'd ever seen, and the depth, well, the instruments couldn't even measure it accurately. The screen just kept flashing unknown over and over. That should have been our first warning sign. But we were scientists. The unknown is what we live for, right? The first time we sent a camera down, we didn't expect anything unusual. It was one of our standard underwater drones, equipped with high-definition cameras and sonar. We watched from the control room as it descended, the blue fading into darkness. For a while, it was normal. Fish, the occasional weird-looking jellyfish, the stuff you'd expect at those depths. But then the camera glitched. At first, we thought it was a technical issue. The screen flickered, went static for a few seconds, then returned. Nothing strange about that in the deep sea. But the thing is, when the feed came back, there was something. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable. A shadow lingering at the edge of the frame. Too far away to make out any details, but big, really big. The kind of big that makes you feel small, insignificant. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The rest of the descent was uneventful, but we couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, or maybe just debris floating past. After all, we were miles below the surface. Anything could cause strange shadows. But deep down I knew something was wrong. The next day, we sent the camera down again. This time, we were ready. We had adjusted the settings, improved the resolution, even added an extra camera for a wider view. And once again, everything was fine, at first. But as the drone approached the trench, the feed cut out. Just like before, the screen went static. And when it came back, I'll never forget what I saw. There were eyes. Dozens of them, all staring at the camera. They weren't fish eyes though. They were too large, too human-like. But they couldn't have been human. Nothing that deep should be human. I tried to calm the team, explaining it could be some undiscovered species or a group of squid. But I was lying. To them and to myself. Those eyes weren't natural. They felt intelligent, like they knew we were watching. And worse, they didn't want us there. We pulled the drone back up, and I went over the footage frame by frame. The eyes were only there for a moment before they vanished. But the longer I stared at the screen, the more uneasy I became. There was something else, something hidden in the dark. It wasn't just watching us. It was waiting. Despite everything, curiosity got the best of us. We decided to send the drone down one last time. This time, we equipped it with lights powerful enough to turn night into day, hoping to get a clear view of whatever was lurking in the trench. I regretted that decision the moment we launched the drone. As it descended, the lights illuminated the water around it, revealing more of the abyss than I'd ever seen. At first, it was beautiful, like an alien world untouched by human hands. But the deeper it went, the more the beauty faded, replaced by something more sinister. The water was too still, too quiet. Even the fish seemed to avoid the area, swimming in the opposite direction as if they knew something we didn't. And then it happened. The drone stopped moving, the lights flickering. I leaned in, my heart pounding. The camera feed was clear, but something was wrong. The trench was no longer empty. There was a shape. A massive, towering shape. It wasn't clear at first, more like a shadow against the darkness. But as the drone's lights flickered back on, I saw it in full. It was. I don't even know how to describe it. It was as if the trench itself had come alive. The walls seemed to shift and move, forming a body, a face. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely inhuman either. It was ancient, otherworldly, and it was watching us. Those same eyes, dozens of them, all fixated on the camera. The drone's signal went dead after that, and we lost contact. I wanted to pull it back up to get out of there, but the controls weren't responding. It was as if whatever was down there didn't want us to leave. That night, I had nightmares. In my dreams, I was sinking into the trench, those eyes staring at me from every direction. I tried to swim back up, but the deeper I went, the heavier the water became until I couldn't move at all. And then, just before I woke up, I saw it. The thing from the trench. But this time, it wasn't watching through a camera. It was right in front of me, close enough to touch, and it whispered my name. I woke up in a cold sweat, but the nightmare didn't end there. The next morning, one of the crew members was missing. We searched the ship, called out to them, but they were gone. The only thing we found was a note scribbled on their bunk, "It's coming." I don't know how to explain what happened next. Over the following days, more crew members vanished. They didn't leave notes, didn't pack their things. They just disappeared. And every time one of them was gone, I could feel the presence of that thing, the thing from the trench, growing stronger. It was like it was getting closer. By the end of the week, it was just me and the captain left. We decided to abandon the mission to get as far away from that trench as possible. But when we tried to leave, the ship wouldn't move. The engine was fine, the weather was clear, but we were stuck. It was like something was holding us in place. That night, I saw it again. Not in a dream, but in real life. It was in the water just below the surface, staring up at me with those same eyes. I tried to warn the captain, but it was too late. He was already gone. Now it's just me. I don't know how much longer I have. I can hear it outside the ship, scraping against the hull, whispering my name. It's waiting for me, and I know I won't be able to resist much longer. If anyone finds this, stay away from the trench. Don't go looking for it. Don't send cameras down there. Some things aren't meant to be discovered. Because when you look into the abyss, sometimes it looks back. I wasn't the kind of doctor who believed in the supernatural or anything beyond what I could see, measure, and diagnose. Medicine, for me, was about facts, hard data, symptoms, and treatments that made sense. But that all started to change when I began noticing something strange. It began about 6 months ago with an elderly woman named Mrs. Sullivan. She came in complaining about chest pains. As I was running through the usual questions, she mentioned something peculiar. "I know it sounds strange, but my left eye has been twitching," she said, rubbing her temple. "Not all the time, just in the mornings." I scribbled it down, even though I didn't think it was relevant. I examined her thoroughly, found no evidence of neurological issues, no eye irritation, nothing. We treated her chest pains, and she went on her way. But 2 weeks later, I got a call from her daughter. "Dr. Jensen, my mother's having some sort of seizure. Her left eye. It's twitching non-stop. We're bringing her to the ER." It was odd, but I dismissed it as a coincidence. I didn't have time to worry about it, but it wasn't long before something similar happened again. A man in his 40s came in for back pain, but during our consultation, he mentioned offhandedly, "You know, I've been feeling this strange tightness in my throat. It's like I want to cough, but nothing comes out." We did the usual tests, and nothing turned up. His throat was fine. His back pain was the priority, so we treated that. 2 days later, he called, his voice raspy and full of panic. "Dr. Jensen, it's my throat. It's swelling. I can't breathe." It escalated fast, and he ended up in the ICU with severe throat inflammation. I remember sitting at my desk after hearing the news, that uncomfortable feeling creeping up my spine. Twice now, patients had told me about a symptom that didn't seem to exist, and then it appeared. I couldn't ignore it anymore when it happened a third time. A teenager, Megan, came in for fatigue and headaches. As we talked, she casually mentioned that she had been hearing a faint ringing in her ears. "It's probably nothing," she said, shrugging. "Just a little noise, you know." Her hearing tests came back fine, and there was no sign of infection. I brushed it off as stress, but not even a week later, she was rushed into the hospital. Her parents said she was screaming about the ringing becoming so loud that she couldn't think, couldn't sleep. By the time they brought her in, Megan was half conscious, lost in a world of unbearable noise only she could hear. That's when the pattern became too clear to ignore. Every patient who mentioned a symptom that didn't seem to exist, they were always right, and it always happened after they had left my office, sometimes days later, sometimes weeks. But it wasn't just that they were right. It was as if they predicted something that shouldn't have been there. At first, I tried to rationalize it. I told myself that patients sometimes sense things in their bodies before doctors could. Maybe these symptoms were so subtle that they were just hard to detect early on. But then, it got worse. I started having nightmares. I'd be in my clinic looking over patient charts, and every page would be filled with symptoms. Hundreds of them, swirling around like ink blots on the paper. The patients in my dreams were distorted, shadows of themselves, their faces twisted with pain, their eyes pleading for me to help them. But I couldn't. I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't come out, and their symptoms would start to consume them, suffocating them right before my eyes. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding as if I had just run a marathon. The feeling of helplessness stayed with me long after I left my bed. One day, the situation escalated beyond anything I could comprehend. A young woman named Clara came in. She was in perfect health, just in for a routine checkup, but halfway through, she suddenly stopped talking. Her eyes went wide, and she grabbed my hand. "Something's wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. I can feel it. My skin, it's crawling." She was shaking, looking at her arms as if bugs were swarming over them. But when I examined her, there was nothing. Her skin was perfectly clear. I tried to reassure her, telling her it was likely stress, perhaps some nerves. But deep down I knew. I knew that soon something would happen to her skin. I didn't know what, but I could feel it in my bones. 2 days later, I got the call I had been dreading. Clara had developed a violent rash, her skin inflamed and blistering, as if it had been burned from the inside out. The specialists were baffled. They couldn't explain it, and no treatment seemed to help. She was in agony, her body tearing itself apart from the inside. I had to face it. Something was wrong. Something beyond science, beyond reason. These patients were predicting symptoms before they manifested, and I was somehow involved. I began to dread every new appointment, wondering what new nightmare my patients would bring to life. The final straw came when I started feeling sick myself. At first, it was just a cough, nothing alarming. But then I began to feel a tightness in my chest, like something was constricting my lungs. I knew it wasn't a regular illness. I knew I was becoming part of the same horrifying pattern. I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? I was the doctor, the one supposed to have all the answers, and yet here I was, helpless in the face of whatever this was. I stopped seeing patients after that. I locked myself in my office, afraid that if I saw another patient, I would make their worst fears come true. But the calls kept coming, patients describing symptoms they hadn't yet felt, and then, days later, those very symptoms blossoming into terrifying realities. The worst part was that the symptoms started to become more severe. They weren't just minor discomforts or pains anymore. They were life-threatening. Sudden paralysis, uncontrollable bleeding, organ failure. The last patient I saw before I shut myself away described feeling like there was something watching them. They said they couldn't see it, but they could feel its presence looming over them, suffocating them with its gaze. 2 days later, that patient died of a heart attack. No medical explanation, just gone. Now, I sit here in my office waiting. I can feel it too, whatever it is. The cough has gotten worse. My chest feels like it's being squeezed by an invisible hand, and I can barely breathe. My skin is crawling, just like Clara's. I know what's coming for me. I've seen it in the eyes of every patient I've diagnosed. I don't know if it's a curse or some twisted force beyond my understanding, but whatever it is, it's taking them, and it's coming for me next. As I sit here, staring at my reflection in the darkened window, I see it. A figure, barely visible, standing behind me, watching. I was never the superstitious type. But now, as the air grows colder and the room seems to shrink around me, I realize I can't escape this. The symptoms will always catch up. They always do. I never thought my life would be anything more than books, dusty shelves, and the quiet hum of the library. That's what drew me to the profession, peace. There was nothing extraordinary about my days. Every morning I walked through the stone archways of our old town library, climbed the spiral stairs to the archive room, and spent hours cataloging old manuscripts and forgotten records. The smell of old paper had become my comfort. I liked the feeling of being in control of history, preserving it, keeping it organized and intact. But one afternoon changed everything. I had just finished logging a few government records from the 1930s when I noticed a document on the edge of my desk that hadn't been there before. Its edges were frayed, and the paper had a yellowish tint as if it had been stored for decades, yet there was no dust on it, no sign that it had ever sat undisturbed. Curious, I picked it up. The title at the top of the page was handwritten, in a script so familiar I could have sworn it was my own. Chronicle of the Archivist's Life. I laughed. A practical joke from one of my colleagues, no doubt. I was known for my meticulous work, always jokingly referred to as the living history book. But as I scanned the first few lines, my amusement faded. The document described my morning, everything. It mentioned the coffee I spilled on my shirt when I arrived, the way I cursed under my breath, even the exact words I'd muttered to myself as I cleaned it up. I flipped the page, and it continued, detailing things I had done in the last hour, right down to the records I'd just finished logging. A chill ran down my spine. I set the document aside and rubbed my eyes, convincing myself that I must be overworked. A prank. I grabbed the stack of records I had been working on, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that gnawed at me. But the more I tried to focus, the more distracted I became. That document. I couldn't ignore it. Minutes later, against my better judgment, I turned back to it. There were new lines that hadn't been there before. It now described me standing by the desk, hesitating, the same action I'd just taken. It was updating itself as I moved. I flipped through the pages. There were only 3, but something told me there would be more if I kept looking. I tried to tear the paper, but it wouldn't rip. The edges seemed to mend themselves as soon as I applied pressure. Panic began to bubble in my chest. I wasn't imagining this. Whatever this was, it was real. Without thinking, I shoved the document into the trash can and slammed the lid shut. I walked back to my desk, taking deep breaths, trying to pretend it didn't exist. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a 4th page lying on the desk. I hadn't added it. I hadn't touched it since I threw it away. This page was worse. It described me frantically tossing the document in the trash and sitting back down, panic written on my face. Then it went further. It said I would check the door to the archive room, find it locked, and try to leave. The room would grow darker, the lights flickering as I realized I was trapped. My breath caught. Slowly, I stood and walked to the door. My hand hovered over the handle, heart racing, but I didn't touch it. I couldn't. Because if I did, that meant the document was right. It meant that I had no control. I stayed frozen there for what felt like hours before I finally yanked my hand back and returned to my desk. But a new page was waiting for me. The lights flickered. It was as though the room itself was breathing, the old wooden shelves creaking, the air thick with the scent of musty paper and something else, something rotten. I needed to get out, but I knew I had no escape. The document detailed the next few hours of my life, each word appearing as if it had been written moments before. It said I would be stuck in this room until nightfall, searching for a way out but never finding one. It even described my growing dread and desperation. I flipped to the last page. It stopped mid-sentence, as if the story was waiting for me to live it before it could finish. I tried to scream for help, but my voice barely made a sound, as if the walls absorbed every bit of it. My phone had no signal. No one would come up to this floor. It was too remote, too forgotten. I was alone with the document and whatever strange force was making it. Hours passed. The document grew. Page after page appeared, each describing every breath, every twitch of my fingers, every tear that slipped down my cheek. I couldn't stop reading it, even though each new page brought me closer to something I didn't want to face. Then the final page appeared. It was blank at first. I stared at it, my pulse racing, waiting for the ink to form. Slowly, one word appeared at the top, end. I stood frozen, eyes glued to that single word. My chest felt tight, my throat dry. Whatever this was, it was over. But then the ink shifted. Letters blurred into one another, and more words took shape. The archivist will find the truth. My hands trembled as I read the line. What truth? What was it talking about? I glanced around the room, suddenly aware of how heavy the air had become, how thick the silence was, like something was watching me. The document detailed how I would walk to the farthest corner of the room behind the oldest stacks of forgotten texts. There, it said, I would find a trapdoor hidden beneath the floorboards. I didn't want to go, but I was no longer in control. My legs moved on their own, leading me to that dark corner. The wood creaked under my weight, and sure enough, there it was, a trapdoor, small and unassuming, its handle covered in dust. Against my will, my fingers grasped the handle and pulled. The door opened with a creak, revealing a set of ancient, crumbling stairs descending into darkness. The document described me descending the stairs, my heart pounding as I reached the bottom. The page went on to say that I would find something down there, something that had been waiting for me all along. With each step I took, the air grew colder, more oppressive. I reached the bottom, and the smell hit me first, rot, decay, and something else that turned my stomach. A dim light flickered, revealing a small room lined with shelves, and on one of those shelves, nestled between two thick, leather-bound books, was a document identical to the one upstairs. It was mine. I reached for it, my fingers trembling. The moment I touched it, the walls around me seemed to shift, to breathe, as if the library itself was alive. The document flipped open on its own, revealing one last line. The archivist becomes part of the story. Before I could scream, the darkness closed in around me, and the last thing I saw was my name, written in the same familiar script, etched forever into the pages of the library. The document had been right. I never left that room. And now it's waiting for someone else to find it. I'd been a ski guide for nearly a decade, leading thrill-seekers across treacherous paths and icy landscapes. The mountains had always felt like home, cold, unforgiving, but honest. That was until the day I discovered it. The glacier sat beyond the usual routes, untouched by tourists or locals. I found it purely by accident while scouting a new path for an adventurous group. The morning fog was dense, making visibility poor, but I knew these mountains like the back of my hand. I decided to push forward, thinking the day's chill was just another factor to navigate. But as I trekked deeper into the frozen wilderness, something strange caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, shadows cast by the rising sun or distorted reflections in the ice. But no, it was more than that. Embedded deep within the glacier were shapes, vaguely human but not quite. They were translucent, pale, and frozen beneath layers of ice. I counted 5 of them, standing motionless, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached, kneeling down to peer closer. Their faces were blurry, unrecognizable, but there was something unsettling about them. It felt as if they were staring back at me. I reached out, placing a gloved hand on the ice. The surface was freezing, of course, but I could have sworn the air around them was colder, unnaturally so. I laughed it off. Must be a weird formation, I muttered to myself, standing up and shaking the snow from my coat. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the shapes, it was the quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl, where even the wind doesn't dare whisper. By the time I got back to camp, I had decided not to mention the shapes to the group. No need to spook anyone over something as simple as ice formations, right? Besides, I'd return later to take a closer look, maybe bring a colleague along for a second opinion. A week passed before I could return to the glacier. The weather had worsened, heavy snowfalls making travel difficult. But the shapes lingered in my mind, nagging at me in the quiet moments before sleep. I felt compelled, as if I had to go back, so I did, alone. The trek back to the glacier was harder this time. The snow was deeper, and the wind whipped viciously, cutting through my layers. But when I arrived, I noticed something that stopped me dead in my tracks. The shapes, they were closer to the surface. I couldn't explain it. I had marked the spot before leaving, and now they had moved, almost as if they were pushing their way out of the ice. I got down on my knees again, staring hard at the figures. There was no mistaking it. These things had shifted. Their blurry faces were now clearer, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I thought I saw one of their mouths move. I scrambled back, my heart pounding. This couldn't be happening. I'd heard of ice shifting, glaciers moving over time, but not like this, not this fast. I should have left then, should have turned around and gone back to the safety of camp. But something about those figures called to me. Against my better judgment, I stayed, watching the ice. Hours passed, the sky dimming as dusk approached, but nothing more happened. I convinced myself it had been a trick of the light, that maybe the change in weather had caused the ice to expand or contract, creating the illusion of movement. I made a mental note to tell the authorities once I returned. It could be a potential hazard after all. But as I started to leave, I heard it, a faint cracking sound. I froze, turning back toward the glacier. The sound was soft at first, like the distant snap of a tree branch in the wind. Then it grew louder. The ice was shifting, splitting open ever so slightly around the shapes. My breath hitched as I watched in horror. One of the figures was moving, for real this time, its head tilting ever so slowly to one side. Its hollow eyes stared straight at me. Panic surged through me, and I bolted, the cold biting at my face as I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the camp. I didn't sleep that night, and when morning came, I resolved to leave the mountains for good. But something was wrong. No matter how hard I tried to push it out of my mind, I felt drawn back to the glacier. It was like a magnet pulling me in, a whisper in the back of my mind telling me to return. Against my better judgment, I found myself packing my gear again the next morning, heading back to that cursed place. The third time I saw the glacier, the figures were almost free. The ice around them had cracked wide open, their bodies leaning outward, as if ready to step out into the world. They were closer to the surface than ever before, their faces fully visible now, twisted, agonized expressions that looked disturbingly human. I took a step back, trembling. "What the hell are you?" I whispered, my breath coming out in shaky puffs. As if in response, one of the figures twitched. Then, with a sickening crack, its arm broke free of the ice. It reached toward me, slow but deliberate, its long skeletal fingers curling through the air. I turned and ran, faster than I'd ever run in my life. This time, I wasn't coming back. Whatever those things were, they weren't natural. They weren't supposed to be there. And I wasn't about to stick around to find out why. But as the days passed, the nightmares started. I'd dream of the glacier, of the figures breaking free, chasing me across the ice. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, they were always behind me. I left the mountains shortly after that, moving to a warmer climate far from the snow and ice. But even here, the nightmares follow me. I can feel them, those figures, still out there waiting. They're getting closer, I know it. I don't understand how, but I know they are. It's been months since I last saw the glacier, but today, something changed. This morning, I woke up to find frost creeping across my bedroom window. I live in a place where it never snows, where the sun shines nearly every day. Yet there it was, ice spreading slowly across the glass. And behind it, I swear I saw a face. They found me. I don't know how much longer I have, but I can feel it, the cold creeping in, the whisper of the wind, the faint sound of ice cracking in the distance. They're coming for me. You'd think working as a gym trainer, you'd be used to the silence of an empty gym. The hum of machines at rest, the clinking of metal plates as they settle, the faint echo of your own breath. It's usually calming. At least it used to be. It started about a month ago. I was closing up after my last client, a regular named Matt. He had just left, and I was in that sweet spot of the evening where I could work out alone, undisturbed. I liked those moments. No distractions, no small talk. Just me, the weights, and a few solid sets to burn off the day. But that night, something felt off. I remember finishing my set on the bench press, standing up to catch my breath when I saw it. The dumbbells on the rack next to me, a couple of meters away, shifted. They didn't fall off, just moved, like someone had brushed past them. I stood there for a moment, blinking, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe the vibrations from my workout caused them to budge. I shrugged it off. But then it happened again. I was halfway through some squats when I heard the familiar clank of weights being picked up and dropped back onto the rack. Only, I wasn't touching anything. My hands were on the bar, lifting. I turned my head slowly, heart racing, and I swear I saw one of the dumbbells float a few inches before dropping back down. I froze. What the? I muttered aloud, backing away, my eyes locked on the rack. The gym was empty, completely empty. It had been for the past half hour. My hands shook as I wiped the sweat off my forehead, trying to shake the unease crawling up my spine. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. I'd had a long day after all. Exhaustion can do weird things to a person, right? That's what I told myself. I packed up early that night, skipping the rest of my workout and convincing myself that I was just tired. Maybe I'd pushed myself too hard. But it didn't stop. The next time I worked out alone, it happened again. This time, I was sure of it. I was on the treadmill, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw the barbell on the bench press twitch. It jerked upward, the plates rattling softly, then lowered back down as if an invisible force was testing its weight. I nearly tripped trying to stop the treadmill, my pulse pounding, not from the run, but from sheer panic. My mind raced with questions. Was someone messing with me? But who? The gym had security cameras. I would have seen if anyone had snuck in. I checked the footage later that night, fingers trembling as I scrolled through the timeline. But the cameras showed nothing. No one was there. It was just me, and the weights moving on their own. Over the next few days, I tried everything to rationalize it. Maybe there was something wrong with the equipment. Maybe vibrations from traffic outside were causing the shifts. But the more it happened, the harder it was to explain away. There was one moment I'll never forget. I had been in the middle of a deadlift, trying to focus on my form, when the barbell in my hands started to pull. Hard. Not from gravity or momentum. No, it felt like something was tugging it, trying to wrench it out of my grip. I strained against it, my muscles screaming in protest, but the force was relentless. I had to drop the weight before it pulled me down with it. The sound of the barbell crashing against the floor echoed through the empty gym, but nothing else moved. I stood there, chest heaving, staring at the bar like it had just tried to strangle me. I wasn't imagining it anymore. Something was in that gym with me, and it wanted me to know. I stopped staying late after that. The late-night workouts became too much. I found myself making excuses to leave as soon as my last client was gone. But the dread lingered. Every time I stepped into the gym, I could feel it, a heavy, unseen presence lurking just out of sight, waiting. It wasn't just the weights anymore. The mirrors started playing tricks on me too. I'd catch glimpses of movement, flickers of shadows that shouldn't have been there. Sometimes, when I'd look up after a set, I'd see the outline of someone behind me in the reflection. Tall, broad-shouldered, and unmoving. But when I spun around, there was no one. One night, curiosity got the better of me, or maybe it was fear. Either way, I stayed late, determined to figure out what the hell was going on. I set up my phone, aiming the camera at the weights while I worked out. Maybe I could catch something on tape, something to prove that I wasn't losing my mind. Everything was fine for the first 20 minutes. I went through my usual routine, squats, deadlifts, push-ups, keeping one eye on the weights the whole time. But then, just as I was finishing up a set of curls, the lights flickered. I froze, staring at the overhead fluorescents as they buzzed and dimmed, casting long, distorted shadows across the gym floor. And that's when I heard it. Breathing, not mine. It was slow, ragged, and close. Too close. My heart leaped into my throat as I turned to face the weight rack. One of the dumbbells was hovering, inches off the ground, just floating there like someone was holding it, testing its weight. My legs locked in place, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I could feel the air around me grow colder, and that breathing, it was right next to me now, whispering in my ear, chilling my skin. And then the dumbbell dropped. I grabbed my phone and bolted for the door, barely managing to lock up behind me. When I got home, I immediately checked the footage, but the screen was nothing but static. Whatever had happened, it didn't want to be seen. That was the last time I worked out alone at the gym, but it didn't stop there. No, it followed me home. I thought I was safe, thought I could leave it all behind by staying out of the gym after hours. But now, every time I lift weights in my garage, I feel it again. The air grows heavy, and I hear that same slow breathing. Sometimes I'll catch the dumbbells shifting, just like before. Only this time, it's worse. Last night, as I was about to start a set, I saw it. A shadow in the corner of the room, tall and broad-shouldered, just like the reflection I had seen in the gym mirror. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep after that. I couldn't. I don't know what it is or what it wants, but I can feel it getting closer. Every day, the weights shift more, The shadows grow darker, and the air grows colder. I'm not sure how much longer I can take it. I don't know what'll happen when it finally decides to make its move. But I'm scared, more scared than I've ever been. If you ever find yourself working out alone, late at night, and you notice the weights moving when they shouldn't, leave. Don't wait. Don't stay to figure it out. Because whatever's there, it's not friendly. And it's waiting for its chance to take over. I can still remember the day I found that deck of cards. It was raining, the kind of weather that keeps people indoors. Not ideal for a street magician like me. But the bills don't pay themselves, and I was used to towing it out. I had my usual spot by the fountain downtown, performing sleight of hand tricks for anyone who'd stop by. Tourists mostly, people looking for a quick distraction. I wasn't a big-time performer, just a guy trying to get by. That day, though, everything changed. I was packing up when an old man shuffled over, his back hunched under the weight of what looked like centuries of hard living. His clothes were ragged, his skin pale like he hadn't seen the sun in years. I expected him to ask for change, but instead, he handed me something wrapped in a tattered piece of cloth. "A gift for your craft," he croaked, his voice dry like dead leaves in the wind. Before I could say anything, he disappeared into the crowd. I unfolded the cloth, and inside was a deck of cards. At first glance, they looked normal enough, old but still usable. I didn't think much of it, figuring I'd try them out later. But there was something off about them, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the cards. I sat at my tiny apartment's kitchen table, flipping through the deck. The first few were like any you'd find in a regular set: hearts, spades, clubs, diamonds. But then I came across something strange. There was a card that had no suit, no number, just a picture of a woman standing on the corner of a street, holding a child's hand. It was detailed, too detailed for a playing card. It looked almost like a photograph. Creeped out, I shuffled it back into the deck and decided to call it a night. The next day, I was back at the fountain, performing tricks. A small crowd gathered around, nothing unusual. I pulled out the new deck, ready to give it a shot. The first trick went off without a hitch, a simple card swap between two audience members. They laughed, clapped, tossed a few bills in my hat. Then I decided to up the ante and did a prediction trick. I asked one woman from the crowd to pick a card at random. She pulled one from the middle of the deck, and her face went pale. The card she was holding showed a woman who looked exactly like her, standing on a street corner, holding a child's hand. She gasped, dropping the card like it burned her. The crowd grew silent. I picked up the card, my hands shaking. I tried to play it off as part of the act, but inside I was freaking out. How was that even possible? I shoved the card back into the deck and went on with the next trick. This time, I asked a man in the crowd to draw. He pulled a card, his face twisting into confusion. It was blank, just a completely white card, like someone had forgotten to print anything on it. "Is this part of the trick?" he asked, handing it back to me. I forced a smile, saying something about mystery and illusion, but my heart was pounding. I'd never seen a blank card in any deck before. I checked the rest, but they were all fine. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the image of that first card, the woman on the street corner, kept gnawing at me. Later that night, I spread the cards across my table at home. My hands trembled as I pulled out the first card from the top of the deck. It wasn't a regular playing card, it was another image. This one showed an older man sitting at a park bench feeding birds. His face looked familiar. I flipped through the deck, but the next card was blank. And the next, and the next. Only 2 cards left in the entire deck had any images, the woman I'd seen earlier and the man feeding birds. The next few days blurred together. Every time I used the deck, someone would pull an image card that depicted something about them, usually something they'd done recently or were about to do. It was like the cards were showing pieces of their lives, but after every trick, another card would go blank. And once a card went blank, it never came back. One night, after a particularly strange day where 3 people drew blank cards, I decided to stop using the deck. I tossed it in a drawer, hoping to forget about it, but I couldn't. The next morning, the deck was sitting on my kitchen table as if it had crawled out of the drawer itself. I didn't touch it, but I couldn't leave it alone either. I had to know more, had to understand what was happening. So I started experimenting. I'd do tricks for strangers, friends, anyone who would indulge me. And sure enough, the deck never failed. The cards that showed people's lives always hit the mark, sometimes with eerie accuracy. But the blank cards kept piling up. By the end of the week, more than half the deck was blank. That's when I made a mistake. I decided to draw a card for myself. I pulled from the middle of the deck, my heart pounding in my chest. The card I flipped over showed me, sitting alone in my apartment, surrounded by empty chairs. At first I didn't get it, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. I was alone. Utterly alone. The chairs were where people should have been, where friends or family should have sat, but they weren't. They were gone. I dropped the card and stepped away from the table. What did it mean? Was this my future, my fate? I tried to convince myself it was just a trick, that the cards were messing with my head. But then I looked at the next card in the deck. Blank. Every time I performed a trick after that, I felt like the cards were draining something from me. I stopped using the deck entirely, but no matter what I did, I couldn't escape its pull. I tried to get rid of it, dumping it in a trash can, burning it, even throwing it into the river, but every morning it was back on my kitchen table waiting. It got worse. The cards weren't just showing pieces of people's lives anymore, they were showing their deaths. One woman drew a card of herself lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines. A week later, I read in the paper that she'd been in a car accident. Another man drew a card of himself floating face down in a pool. A few days later, his body was found in the river. I couldn't take it anymore. The cards were cursed, twisted, feeding on the lives they depicted, and every time they did, another card turned blank. I was terrified that soon the entire deck would be blank, and when that happened, I'd be next. One night, I finally snapped. I grabbed the deck, shoved it in my coat pocket, and walked into the city, determined to rid myself of it once and for all. The streets were empty, quiet except for the soft hum of distant traffic. I made my way to the old bridge over the river, my heart hammering in my chest. With one final glance at the deck, I hurled it into the black water below. I waited, expecting some sense of relief, but none came. Instead, I felt a chill creep up my spine. I turned around to leave and froze. Standing on the bridge was the old man who had given me the deck. His eyes were hollow, and his lips twisted into a sick smile. "Not so easy, is it?" he rasped. "You can't escape it." I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. The man didn't move, just stood there watching me. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right behind me. When I got home, the deck was waiting on my table, just like always. Only this time, there was one card on top. A blank card with my name written in blood-red letters. I knew then that my time was up. It started on a lazy Sunday afternoon. My wife, Emma, and I were browsing a flea market just outside of town. We weren't looking for anything in particular, just enjoying the crisp autumn air and the buzz of chatter around us. As we weaved through the crowded aisles of knick-knacks and old furniture, something caught Emma's eye. A dusty, leather-bound photo album sat on a rickety table, surrounded by a jumble of faded postcards and yellowed books. The cover was worn and cracked, the kind that had seen better days but still held onto a certain charm. Emma has a soft spot for old things, and I could see the curiosity lighting up her eyes. She picked it up and flipped through the pages, her smile widening. "Look at this, Jack. It's like a time capsule," she said, showing me a black and white photo of a young couple standing in front of an old car. The man selling it leaned in, grinning with a mouthful of crooked teeth. "That one's special. Found it in an estate sale. Don't know who it belonged to, but it's got character, doesn't it?" We weren't planning on buying anything, but something about the album felt magnetic. Without much thought, we handed over a few dollars and took it home. It was just an old photo album after all. What harm could it do? That evening after dinner, we settled on the couch with a bottle of wine and the album between us. We flipped through the first few pages, admiring the old photographs. They were beautiful in a nostalgic way. Snapshots of people we didn't know, moments lost in time. Then we turned to a page that made us both freeze. There, in the middle of the page, was a photo of us. We were standing in front of a small cafe, one I didn't recognize. Emma was wearing the blue dress she bought last summer, and I had on my favorite jacket. The thing is, we had never been to that cafe. I would have remembered it. It had a distinctive sign above the door, a vintage clock embedded in it. "Do you remember this place?" I asked, my voice tinged with confusion. Emma shook her head slowly. "No, I don't. But that's us, Jack. How is that possible?" I stared at the photo, a chill running down my spine. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was us, down to the tiniest detail. My scar on my eyebrow, Emma's charm bracelet. But how could that be? We brushed it off as a bizarre coincidence, maybe some lookalikes or a trick of memory. But as we continued flipping through the album, the unease grew. There were more photos of us, in parks we'd never visited, at events we'd never attended, even standing in front of houses we didn't recognize. Each photo was dated at the bottom. At first, the dates seemed random, but then we noticed they were in chronological order. The photos spanned decades, yet we looked the same in every single one. The latest one was dated last week. "This is insane," Emma whispered, her fingers trembling as she turned another page. "It's like someone's been following us, but these places, we've never been there." The logical part of my brain tried to reason it out. Maybe it was some elaborate prank. Maybe the photos were altered and someone was having a laugh at our expense. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations made sense. We decided to put the album away, shoving it into a drawer in the living room. But it was too late. That night, I dreamed of the places in the photos. A dimly lit street with old lampposts casting long shadows, a garden party filled with strangers who all stared at us with blank eyes, a deserted beach where the waves crashed silently against the shore. I woke up drenched in sweat, the images seared into my mind. The next morning, we found the album on our kitchen table, open to a new page. Emma swore she hadn't touched it, and I knew I hadn't either. The new photo was of us sitting at our kitchen table, staring at the album. The timestamp was 2:30 a.m., just a few hours earlier. Panic set in. We needed to get rid of it. I grabbed the album and drove to the edge of town, tossing it into a dumpster behind an abandoned building. I felt a strange mix of relief and dread as I watched it disappear among the trash. I thought that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. That night, the album was back on our coffee table, pristine as ever. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding. Emma just stared at it, her face pale. I didn't know what to do. It was like the album was taunting us, showing us things we couldn't explain, didn't want to believe. Desperation took over. We tried everything, burning it, tearing it apart, even burying it in the backyard. No matter what we did, the album always reappeared, each time with new photos of us in places we had never been. One morning, we woke up to find a photo of us sleeping in our bed, taken from the corner of the room. The timestamp was 3:00 a.m. I felt violated, like something was watching us, documenting our lives in a way that made my skin crawl. We decided to leave the house, booking a hotel room far from home. We needed a break, some time to think clearly. But the first night in the hotel, we found the album on the nightstand, open to a new photo of us checking into the hotel lobby. It felt like a sick game, one we couldn't escape. Back home, I spent hours researching the album, trying to find any mention of it online. There were whispers on obscure forums, stories of people who had owned it before, but nothing concrete. It was as if the album erased its own history, leaving only the terror it brought to its owners. Then, one night, everything escalated. We found a photo of us standing in front of an old, crumbling house. The date on the photo was tomorrow. I knew the house. It was on the outskirts of town, a place no one ever went. A place that felt wrong, even driving by it. "We have to go," Emma said, her voice barely a whisper. "Maybe if we go there, we can end this." I didn't want to, but what choice did we have? The album was driving us mad, consuming our lives. So, the next day, we drove to the house. It looked exactly like the photo, weathered and abandoned, with an air of decay that made my stomach churn. We stood there, waiting for something to happen. The sun set, casting long shadows across the yard. Nothing moved, the silence pressing in on us like a weight. I felt foolish, standing there, waiting for some answer that would never come. And then we saw it. A figure stood in the doorway, watching us. I couldn't make out its face, but it felt familiar. It raised its hand, holding something out. The album. It was us, and yet it wasn't. The figure was distorted, its features twisted in a way that made my skin crawl. Emma grabbed my hand, pulling me back toward the car. "We need to leave now," she screamed. We stumbled back, but before we could reach the car, everything went dark. I woke up alone, lying on the cold ground. Emma was gone. My head throbbed as I scrambled to my feet, calling out her name. No answer. I ran through the house, my heart racing, but she was nowhere to be found. And then I saw it. The album lay open on the floor, a new photo staring up at me. Emma, standing in a dark room, her eyes wide with terror. The date was today, the time now. I screamed, tearing through the house, searching every corner, every shadow. But it was empty, abandoned, just like it had always been. I was alone, and Emma was gone. I'm writing this now, back at our house, the album sitting on the table in front of me. It's open to the last photo. Me sitting here writing this. I don't know what's going to happen next. But I can feel it, something watching, waiting. The last page is blank, but I know it won't be for long. I'm terrified to turn it. Because I know, deep down, that whatever comes next, it's going to be the end. For both of us. I've always been a pretty private person. I like my space, my routines, and the predictable calm of being alone. My apartment has been my sanctuary for the past 5 years, a tiny one-bedroom place on the 3rd floor of an old brick building in the quieter part of town. It's the kind of building where you know your neighbors by sight, not by name. Just the way I like it. About 2 weeks ago, things started to change. It was a Saturday morning, and I woke up around 9 a.m., just like every other weekend. I stretched, made some coffee, and sat down at my desk to check emails. There, sitting on my keyboard, was a folded piece of paper. My heart skipped a beat. I don't remember leaving any notes for myself. Curious, I unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, precise, almost formal. It read, 9:05 a.m., woke up. 9:10 a.m., made coffee. 9:15 a.m., sat down at the desk. I glanced around the room, feeling a cold sweat forming on my forehead. It was exactly what I had done that morning, down to the minute, but no one else had been in my apartment. I checked the locks. All secure. The windows were shut tight. I shrugged it off, thinking I must have written it myself and just forgotten about it. But it happened again the next day. Another note detailing my morning routine perfectly. This time, I was sure I hadn't written it. I hadn't left my apartment at all on Sunday. I hadn't even opened the door. Yet there it was on my kitchen counter. 8:50 a.m., woke up. 8:55 a.m., made breakfast. 9:00 a.m., watched TV. My hands were shaking as I read it. Someone had to be playing a prank on me. I spent the rest of the day searching my apartment, checking every nook and cranny, looking for hidden cameras or some clue that would explain this. I found nothing. The notes kept coming. Every morning, I'd find one waiting for me in a new spot, on my pillow, the bathroom mirror, the fridge. They detailed everything I did in my apartment, down to the smallest actions. It was like someone was watching me, documenting my every move. I stopped leaving my place, convinced that someone was waiting for me to go out so they could sneak in. One evening, I decided to stay awake all night to catch the person. I brewed a strong pot of coffee and sat in my living room, the lights off, eyes glued to the door. I'd fought off sleep as long as I could, but at some point, I must have nodded off. When I woke up, it was morning, and there was a note in my hand. 3:00 a.m., fell asleep on the couch. 3:30 a.m., turned over and mumbled something. 4:00 a.m., snored quietly. I bolted upright, my heart racing. I had been holding the note the whole time. My mind was spinning with confusion and fear. Who was doing this? How were they getting in? I knew I hadn't left the door unlocked. I hadn't left the couch. I felt a chill run down my spine. Desperate, I called the landlord. He was an old man, grumpy and skeptical, but he agreed to change the locks. I even installed a chain and a deadbolt myself. That night, I slept with a kitchen knife under my pillow, but I still found a note the next morning. This time, it was on the inside of the deadbolt. 4:15 a.m., checked the locks. 4:20 a.m., looked under the bed. 4:30 a.m., tried to stay awake. I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped sleeping, barely ate. I paced around my apartment, feeling like a caged animal. I thought about moving, but the idea of packing up and leaving seemed overwhelming. Besides, what if the notes followed me? One night, after days of no sleep, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my sister. We're not close, but I needed to talk to someone, to hear a familiar voice. I told her everything, expecting her to laugh or call me crazy. Instead, she got quiet. "I found a note like that once," she said softly. "After Mom died. It was on my bedside table, describing what I'd done that day." I thought I was losing my mind. We were silent for a long time after that. I didn't know what to say. I felt a strange sense of relief, but it was mixed with a deeper terror. If she had experienced this too, what did it mean? The next morning, I found the note in the bathroom. But it was different from the others. It wasn't about my day. It was a single sentence. "Get out." I stared at the words, my heart pounding. The handwriting was the same, but something about it felt urgent. I didn't know what to do. I thought about ignoring it, but a feeling of dread washed over me. I packed a bag with a few essentials and left the apartment, not knowing where I was going, just that I had to get out. I checked into a hotel on the other side of town. It was small and dingy, but I felt a little safer there. I fell asleep for the first time in days, exhaustion finally catching up to me. When I woke up, there was a note on the bedside table. "You can't hide." I froze. My eyes darted around the room. The door was locked. The windows were shut. I was alone. My mind was spinning. I picked up the note, my hands trembling. It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. For the next few days, I moved from hotel to hotel, but the notes kept finding me. They became more frequent, more insistent. "Come back. Don't run. It's watching." I didn't know what it was. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I couldn't go back to that apartment. But the fear followed me, like a shadow I couldn't shake off. The final note arrived last night. I had just checked into a new place, a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. I was sitting on the bed, staring blankly at the TV, when I noticed the paper slipped under the door. I unfolded it with shaking hands. "It's here." I dropped the note and backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what it meant, but I felt a cold dread settle over me. I turned around slowly, my eyes scanning the room. And then I saw it. A figure stood in the corner, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, shrouded in darkness, its eyes glowing faintly. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. It felt like time had stopped. The figure stepped closer, and I could see it holding something, a piece of paper. It stretched out its hand, offering it to me. I didn't want to take it, but I couldn't move, couldn't look away. My hand reached out, almost on its own, and I took the note. The handwriting was the same as all the others. "It's over." I looked up, and the figure was gone. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't really gone. It had followed me all this way, and there was no escaping it. No running from it. And then, in the stillness of the room, I felt something cold touch my shoulder. I turned around, but there was nothing there. Just a whisper in the darkness, a voice that sent chills down my spine. "You belong to me now." I didn't scream. I couldn't. I just stood there, paralyzed with fear, as the room seemed to close in around me. The last thing I remember is the feeling of cold fingers wrapping around my wrist, pulling me into the darkness. Now, I'm back in my apartment. I don't know how I got here. The notes are gone, and everything is as it was. But I know I'm not alone. It's always watching. And it's only a matter of time before it takes me again. You know, I never thought I'd get into leatherworking. I stumbled upon it like most people stumble upon their life's passions, by complete accident. I was wandering through a flea market when I saw an old man selling handmade leather goods. They were beautiful, intricate, and the smell of fresh leather drew me in like nothing else. That was years ago, and now I'm proud to call myself a leatherworker. It was a quiet day in my workshop, the kind where time seems to stretch. The usual scent of tanned hides and dyes filled the air, and the rhythmic sound of my needle puncturing the thick leather had me in a sort of trance. That's when I received a package at my doorstep. No sender's name, no address, just a plain brown box with my name scrawled on it in black ink. Inside was a hide, neatly folded. It was the softest leather I had ever touched. It felt almost too smooth, like it wasn't leather at all, but something else entirely. I ran my fingers over it and felt a shiver run down my spine. It was cool to the touch, almost like it had a life of its own. But I shrugged it off. A gift, maybe. Who was I to question my luck? I decided to make a wallet out of it, something simple to test the quality. As I cut through the hide, I noticed it cut like butter. No resistance, no tough fibers to work through. Strange, but not alarming. Yet, I started stitching it, the needle gliding effortlessly. That's when I saw it. The seams, where the needle punctured the leather, began turning red. At first, I thought it was the dye reacting in some weird way, but no, it wasn't dye. It was something else, something thicker, something that moved. I stopped and stared, the needle still in my hand. The red wasn't just spreading, it was pulsing. It looked like tiny veins throbbing along the seams. I reached out to touch it, and the pulsing grew faster, almost like it was alive and could feel me watching. I pulled my hand back, heart pounding. I convinced myself it was just a trick of the light, that I was tired and seeing things. But the hide was there, and so was the pulsing red seam. I left the workshop early that day. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the hide, its softness, and those pulsing seams. The way it seemed to react to my touch haunted me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just some bizarre material defect, but deep down, I knew it was something else. Something wrong. The next morning, I returned to the workshop, determined to figure it out. The hide lay on my workbench, as smooth and eerie as ever. I picked it up, and the red seams immediately started to pulse again. It felt warmer this time, almost like it had a heartbeat of its own. I thought of throwing it away, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to finish the wallet. Maybe if I completed it, the hide would stop reacting. I kept stitching, each puncture causing the seams to bleed a little more. It wasn't just pulsing now, it was spreading, as if the hide was trying to stitch itself together. I could feel it through my gloves, a slight warmth, a faint vibration. When I finished, the wallet looked normal. Almost. The seams were crimson, still slightly throbbing. I set it down and backed away, my hands trembling. The hide hadn't been leather. It had been something alive, something that had bled under my needle. I felt sick, but I needed answers. I called the old man from the flea market, the one who'd gotten me into leatherworking. Maybe he'd know what it was, or at least where it came from. When he picked up, I tried to explain, but as soon as I mentioned the hide, his tone changed. He sounded afraid. "You have to get rid of it," he said, his voice trembling. "Burn it, bury it, just get it away from you. It's not meant to be worked on." "What is it?" I asked, but he wouldn't say. He just kept repeating, "Get rid of it," over and over again, like a broken record. I hung up, feeling even worse than before. I didn't understand what I had gotten myself into, but I knew I had to do something. I decided to burn it. I grabbed the wallet and some matches and headed out to the backyard. I placed it in the fire pit and struck a match. The flame caught the edge of the hide, but instead of burning, it began to scream. I swear it screamed, a high-pitched, eerie wail that filled the air around me. I stumbled back, dropping the matches. The hide writhed in the flames, the seams splitting open, red oozing out like blood. The screams grew louder, more desperate, until I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a bucket of water and doused the fire. The screaming stopped instantly, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. The wallet lay in the pit, untouched by the flames, as if mocking my efforts. I backed away, my mind racing. What was this thing? I had to know. I went back inside, digging through my books and notes, trying to find anything that could explain what I had just seen. Hours passed, and then I found it. An old, forgotten text about cursed objects. It spoke of hides made from the skin of the damned, hides that would react to the touch of a needle and bleed with every stitch. They were cursed to be worked on forever, each puncture a reminder of the pain they had endured in life. I felt a chill run down my spine. The book said these hides were used to trap souls, to bind them in a state of eternal agony. I looked at the wallet, now resting innocently on my workbench. Was there a soul trapped in there? A life bound in that soft, unnatural hide? The thought made me shudder. I knew I had to get rid of it, but how? Burning hadn't worked. I decided to bury it, deep in the woods where no one would find it. I wrapped it in a cloth, its pulsing seams still faintly throbbing under the fabric. It felt like I was holding a heart. I drove out to the woods, the package sitting ominously on the passenger seat. The drive felt longer than usual, each mile stretching out like a warning. I found a clearing, far away from any trails, and started digging. The deeper I dug, the more the ground seemed to resist. The earth was thick and heavy, almost like it didn't want to take the hide. But I kept going, sweat pouring down my face, the shovel biting into the stubborn soil. When the hole was deep enough, I placed the wrapped wallet inside and started covering it. As soon as the last bit of earth fell over it, the ground trembled. It was subtle, like the earth itself was holding its breath. I stepped back, watching as the ground slowly settled, the dirt looking almost too smooth, like it was hiding something. I turned to leave, but then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic pulsing, like a heartbeat, coming from the ground. I froze, my blood running cold. The pulsing grew louder, the earth beginning to tremble again. I stumbled back, fear gripping me. The ground burst open, soil and rocks flying everywhere. The wallet shot up, hovering in the air before me. It was glowing now, the red seams burning like molten lava, the pulsing faster, more frantic. I ran. I ran like I had never run before, my heart pounding in my ears, the ground shaking beneath me. I didn't look back, not until I reached my car. I jumped in, slammed the door and sped away, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I don't know how I made it home, but I did. I locked the doors, drew the curtains, and sat in the dark, trying to calm my racing heart. But then I heard it, the soft, rhythmic pulsing, coming from my workbench. I turned on the light, and there it was. The wallet, sitting there as if it had never left. The seams were bleeding again, the red spreading, pulsing. I backed away, my mind screaming for an answer, a solution, anything. But I knew, deep down, there was nothing I could do. The hide was bound to me now, its curse wrapped around my soul. I tried to leave, to run away, but every time I stepped outside, I could feel it pulling me back, drawing me closer. I'm trapped. Trapped in my own workshop, the wallet sitting there, watching, waiting. I can't escape it. The hide is too soft, the seams too red. And the pulsing, it's growing louder, more insistent. It wants something. It wants me. And I'm afraid, deep down, that one day I'll give in. One day, I'll pick up the needle again, and I'll stitch and stitch until there's nothing left of me but those red, pulsing seams. I can't run. I can't hide. The hide has bound me, and I know, in my heart, that there's no escaping it. One stitch at a time, it's pulling me closer, weaving me into its cursed fabric. And soon, very soon, I'll be part of it forever. Working as a bike mechanic isn't the most glamorous job in the world, but it's honest work. I've always liked the simplicity of it, fixing up broken chains, patching up tires, adjusting gears, nothing too complicated. The small workshop I run in the corner of the town sees a steady flow of customers, mostly kids with their BMX bikes and a few adults with their road bikes. It was a Friday evening when things started to get weird. I was about to close up shop when this guy walked in. He was tall, with a scruffy beard, and looked like he hadn't slept in days. He'd wheeled in an old, beat-up mountain bike, the kind you see abandoned in alleys, with rusted frames and worn-out seats. But something about it caught my eye. The tires looked brand new, almost too new for such an old bike. "Hey, can you check this bike for me?" the guy asked, his voice shaky. "I just bought it from some yard sale, but it's weird." "Weird how?" I asked, wiping my hands on a greasy rag. "The tires," he said, looking around nervously. "They never go flat, and they're always warm." I raised an eyebrow. I've been in this business long enough to hear all kinds of crazy things, but this was new. "Warm tires, huh? Let me take a look." I knelt down and placed my hand on the front tire. Sure enough, it was warm to the touch. Not hot, but definitely warmer than the cool evening air. I checked the back tire, same thing. I pressed down on them, expecting the usual give of air, but they were solid, almost like they were filled with something other than air. "You're right, that is strange," I muttered. I grabbed my pressure gauge and checked the tire pressure. It was perfectly normal, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. "Have you ridden it much?" I asked, glancing up at the guy. He nodded, his eyes darting around the workshop. "Yeah, a few times. It rides smooth, but there's just this feeling, like something's off." I shrugged. "Maybe it's just a well-made bike, but I can check it over if you want. Leave it here, and I'll get back to you." He seemed relieved and quickly agreed. After he left, I wheeled the bike to the back of the shop. I decided to give it a thorough inspection the next day. Little did I know that bike would become the bane of my existence. The next morning, I got to work early. The bike was still where I left it, leaning against the wall. I started with the usual checks: brakes, gears, chain. Everything seemed fine, almost too fine for a bike that looked so old and worn out. Then I moved on to the tires again. They were still warm, even after sitting all night in the cool shop. I decided to remove one of the tires to see what was inside. As I pulled the tire off the rim, a foul metallic smell filled the air. It was like a mix of burnt rubber and something I couldn't quite place, something sharp and almost metallic. I held my breath and peered inside the tire. Instead of the usual inner tube, there was this thick, dark liquid coating the inside. It looked almost like oil, but thicker, more viscous. I dipped my finger in it, and it felt warm, pulsing slightly as if it were alive. I recoiled, wiping my hand on my overalls, my heart racing. "What the hell?" I whispered to myself. I decided to put everything back together and call the guy. Maybe he'd want his money back, or maybe I'd just tell him to come get his creepy bike and never bring it back here again. But when I reached for my phone, I realized I didn't have his number. He hadn't left any contact information. I felt a chill run down my spine. Over the next few days, the bike sat in the corner of the shop, untouched. I didn't want to go near it. Every time I looked at it, I felt this strange sense of unease, like it was watching me, waiting for something. The tires never lost their warmth, and that weird liquid inside them never stopped moving, almost like it was circulating. One evening after I closed up, I heard a noise coming from the back of the shop. It sounded like someone tapping on the concrete floor. I grabbed a wrench and cautiously made my way to the back. The noise grew louder, a steady thumping, like a heartbeat. And there it was, the bike, standing upright, its tires slowly spinning. I felt frozen to the spot, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, slowly, the bike started to move. It rolled forward, then back, as if testing its own balance. "Hey, who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The bike stopped. The tires came to a halt, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, the bike shot forward, slamming into the workbench. Tools scattered everywhere, and I stumbled back, barely catching myself. "What the hell is going on?" I gasped, my heart pounding in my chest. The bike stood still again, leaning slightly to the side, almost like it was mocking me. I ran out of the shop, not daring to look back. I needed to get rid of it. I'd throw it in the river, burn it, whatever it took. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing the sound of the bike's tires spinning in my head, the steady thump-thump-thump like a heartbeat. I was losing it. I needed to get rid of that thing. The next morning, I dragged the bike outside and threw it in the back of my truck. I drove out to the old quarry a few miles out of town. No one ever went there anymore. It was perfect. I pulled up to the edge of the quarry and heaved the bike out of the truck. It landed with a dull thud on the rocky ground. I grabbed it and dragged it to the edge of the cliff, panting and sweating, my hands trembling. "Good riddance," I muttered, and with a final push, I sent the bike tumbling over the edge. It fell for what felt like forever, and then there was a loud splash as it hit the water below. I watched it sink, bubbles rising to the surface, and for the first time in days, I felt a sense of relief. But it didn't last long. As I turned to leave, I heard it, the sound of tires spinning on gravel. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Slowly, I turned back, my heart pounding in my ears. There it was, the bike, standing upright on the edge of the cliff, dripping wet. The tires were spinning faster and faster, water spraying from them like blood. It rolled forward slowly, almost leisurely, and I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. "No, this can't be happening," I whispered, scrambling to my feet. The bike picked up speed, racing towards me, and I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I could hear it behind me, the thumping of the tires growing louder, closer. I reached the truck and jumped in, slamming the door shut. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, gravel flying as I sped down the dirt road. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept driving, praying it wouldn't follow me. It's been weeks now, and I haven't gone back to the shop. I'm staying with a friend in another town, trying to get my head straight, but no matter where I go, I can't escape it. I see it everywhere, in the reflections of car windows, in the shadows of alleyways. I hear it too, the sound of tires spinning, that relentless thump thump thump, like a heartbeat. It's getting closer every day, every night. I know it's only a matter of time before it finds me. I can feel it, that warm, pulsing presence, creeping closer, waiting. I don't know what it wants, but I'm terrified to find out. I don't think I'll be able to run much longer. And when it finally catches up to me, I know there will be no escape. The bike that never goes flat, it's coming for me. And when it does, I don't think I'll survive to tell the tale. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghost stories, haunted houses, cursed objects, it all seemed like make-believe to me, something to pass the time around a campfire. But that all changed last summer when I took a job as a mover. I'd been struggling to make ends meet and needed the extra cash, so when my buddy Dave offered me a gig helping clear out an old estate, I jumped at the chance. The place was massive, a crumbling mansion on the edge of town that had been abandoned for years. Rumor had it the previous owner, some reclusive old guy, had passed away without any family, leaving the house and everything in it to gather dust. Easy money, Dave had said, grinning as we pulled up to the creaky front gate. We just got haul all this junk out, take what's valuable, and get rid of the rest. He made it sound simple enough, but as soon as we stepped inside, I felt something was off. The air was thick and musty, like the house had been holding its breath for decades. The floorboards groaned under our weight, and every corner seemed cloaked in shadows. But I shook off the unease and got to work. Most of the rooms were filled with the usual stuff, dusty furniture, stacks of old books, boxes full of yellowed papers. It wasn't until we reached the attic that things took a turn for the strange. The attic was cluttered, a chaotic mess of forgotten possessions. As we made our way through the piles of junk, something caught my eye. A large, old-fashioned trunk tucked away in the far corner. It was massive, covered in worn leather and iron studs, with a thick padlock hanging from the latch. "What do you think's inside?" I asked Dave, nudging the trunk with my foot. It didn't budge. I mean, this thing was heavy, way too heavy. "Beats me," he shrugged. "Probably just more junk, but let's take a look." It took both of us to drag the trunk out into the open. I fished a crowbar from my tool bag and pried at the lock. It took a few tries, but eventually the lock snapped off and the lid creaked open. Inside, the trunk was filled with what looked like random odds and ends. A stack of old clothes, a few books, and a small box of trinkets. It didn't seem like much, but as I reached in to move things around, I felt a strange resistance. It was as if there was something more, something deeper. "Hold on," I said, pushing aside the clothes and books. Beneath them, the bottom of the trunk didn't seem quite right. It was too thick, like there was a false bottom or something. "What the hell?" I muttered, running my hand along the base. Sure enough, there was a seam. With a little effort, I pried the false bottom open, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. And that's when things got weird. The compartment was deep, way deeper than it should have been, like it stretched far beyond the trunk itself. I reached in, feeling around, and my fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. I pulled it out, a small, ornate key, old and tarnished. But that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was that the compartment seemed to be shifting. Every time I reached in, the contents seemed to change. One moment I'd be touching something soft, like fabric, and the next I'd feel something sharp and jagged. It was as if the trunk was hiding more than just physical objects, as if it was concealing layers of itself, deeper and darker with each one revealed. "Dude, this is freaky," Dave said, peering over my shoulder. "What the hell is this thing?" "I don't know," I whispered, feeling a chill run down my spine, "but I don't like it. We should have closed the trunk and left it alone." We should have walked away right then and there. But curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important, something valuable hidden inside. I'd reached in again, feeling the walls of the compartment. My fingers brushed against another latch. Without thinking, I pulled it, and the bottom of the compartment gave way, revealing yet another layer beneath. This time, it wasn't just a compartment. It was like a void, a dark, endless space that seemed to pull at me. I could feel it, like a cold breeze, whispering in the back of my mind, urging me to reach further, to see what lay hidden in the darkness. "I don't think we should mess with this," Dave said, his voice shaky. "This feels wrong, man, really wrong." But I didn't listen. I couldn't. I was consumed by the need to know, to uncover whatever secrets the trunk was hiding. I reached in again, my arm disappearing up to the elbow, then the shoulder. It was like the trunk was swallowing me whole. I should have stopped. I should have pulled back. But I didn't. I kept reaching deeper and deeper until my fingers brushed against something cold and smooth, like polished wood. I grabbed hold of it and pulled. The trunk shook violently, the lid snapping shut on my arm with a bone-crunching force. I screamed, pain shooting up my arm as I tried to yank it free. But the trunk wouldn't let go. It was as if it had a life of its own, like it was hungry, desperate to keep me trapped. Dave was yelling, trying to pry the lid open, but it was no use. The trunk was too strong, too powerful. I could feel it, like a living thing, coiling around my arm, pulling me in. "Get out! Get out!" Dave shouted, his face pale with fear. "Let it go, man. Let it go." But I couldn't. I was in too deep. And then, just as suddenly as it had grabbed me, the trunk released. I stumbled back, clutching my arm, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was that? Dave gasped, his eyes wide with terror. I looked at the trunk, its lid now firmly shut, the padlock somehow back in place. My arm was throbbing, but more than that, I felt something else. A presence, a darkness that seemed to linger in the air, wrapping around us like a shroud. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We need to leave. Now." We didn't take anything with us. We just ran, stumbling down the stairs, through the cluttered rooms, and out the front door. We didn't stop until we were back in the truck, the mansion looming behind us like a silent, watchful sentinel. I don't remember much about the drive back. My mind was racing, my thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. What the hell had just happened? What was in that trunk? I wish I could say that was the end of it, that we left the mansion and never looked back. But that would be a lie. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the trunk, its dark, gaping maw, pulling me in. I could still feel it, like a phantom limb, the cold grip of its unseen depths clinging to me. And then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a faint whisper, like a breath against my ear. "Come back." I jolted awake, my heart pounding. The room was dark, the shadows long and twisted. I could feel it, that same presence, lurking just out of sight, waiting. I knew then that it wasn't over. The trunk had taken something from me, something I couldn't get back. And it wanted more. I tried to ignore it, tried to push the memory away, but the whispers kept coming, night after night, calling me back to the mansion, back to the attic, back to the trunk. I don't know how much longer I can resist. I can feel it, that pull, growing stronger every day. It's like the trunk is calling to me, drawing me in deeper and deeper into its darkness. And I'm afraid that one day I won't be able to resist. One day I'll go back. And when I do, I don't think I'll come out again. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghost stories, haunted houses, cursed objects, they all seemed like make-believe to me, something to pass the time around a campfire. But that all changed last summer when I took a job as a mover. I'd been struggling to make ends meet and needed the extra cash, so when my buddy Dave offered me a gig helping clear out an old estate, I jumped at the chance. The place was massive. A crumbling mansion on the edge of town that had been abandoned for years. Rumor had it the previous owner, some reclusive old guy, had passed away without any family, leaving the house and everything in it to gather dust. "Easy money," Dave had said, grinning as we pulled up to the creaky front gate. "We just got to haul all this junk out, take what's valuable, and get rid of the rest." He made it sound simple enough, but as soon as we stepped inside, I felt something was off. The air was thick and musty, like the house had been holding its breath for decades. The floorboards groaned under our weight, and every corner seemed cloaked in shadows. But I shook off the unease and got to work. Most of the rooms were filled with the usual stuff: dusty furniture, stacks of old books, boxes full of yellowed papers. It wasn't until we reached the attic that things took a turn for the strange. The attic was cluttered, a chaotic mess of forgotten possessions. As we made our way through the piles of junk, something caught my eye. A large, old-fashioned trunk tucked away in the far corner. It was massive, covered in worn leather and iron studs, with a thick padlock hanging from the latch. "What do you think's inside?" I asked Dave, nudging the trunk with my foot. It didn't budge. I mean, this thing was heavy, way too heavy. "Beats me," he shrugged. "Probably just more junk, but let's take a look." It took both of us to drag the trunk out into the open. I fished a crowbar from my tool bag and pried at the lock. It took a few tries, but eventually the lock snapped off and the lid creaked open. Inside, the trunk was filled with what looked like random odds and ends. A stack of old clothes, a few books, and a small box of trinkets. It didn't seem like much, but as I reached in to move things around, I felt a strange resistance. It was as if there was something more, something deeper. "Hold on," I said, pushing aside the clothes and books. Beneath them, the bottom of the trunk didn't seem quite right. It was too thick, like there was a false bottom or something. "What the hell?" I muttered, running my hand along the base. Sure enough, there was a seam. With a little effort, I pried the false bottom open, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. And that's when things got weird. The compartment was deep, way deeper than it should have been, like it stretched far beyond the trunk itself. I reached in, feeling around, and my fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. I pulled it out, a small, ornate key, old and tarnished. But that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was that the compartment seemed to be shifting. Every time I reached in, the contents seemed to change. One moment I'd be touching something soft, like fabric, and the next I'd feel something sharp and jagged. It was as if the trunk was hiding more than just physical objects, as if it was concealing layers of itself, deeper and darker with each one revealed. "Dude, this is freaky," Dave said, peering over my shoulder. "What the hell is this thing?" "I don't know," I whispered, feeling a chill run down my spine. "But I don't like it. We should have closed the trunk and left it alone. We should have walked away right then and there." But curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important, something valuable hidden inside. I reached in again, feeling the walls of the compartment. My fingers brushed against another latch. Without thinking, I pulled it, and the bottom of the compartment gave way, revealing yet another layer beneath. This time, it wasn't just a compartment. It was like a void, a dark, endless space that seemed to pull at me. I could feel it, like a cold breeze, whispering in the back of my mind, urging me to reach further, to see what lay hidden in the darkness. "I don't think we should mess with this," Dave said, his voice shaky. "This feels wrong, man, really wrong." But I didn't listen. I couldn't. I was consumed by the need to know, to uncover whatever secrets the trunk was hiding. I reached in again, my arm disappearing up to the elbow, then the shoulder. It was like the trunk was swallowing me whole. I should have stopped. I should have pulled back. But I didn't. I kept reaching, deeper and deeper, until my fingers brushed against something cold and smooth, like polished wood. I grabbed hold of it and pulled. The trunk shook violently, the lid snapping shut on my arm with a bone-crunching force. I screamed, pain shooting up my arm as I tried to yank it free. But the trunk wouldn't let go. It was as if it had a life of its own, like it was hungry, desperate to keep me trapped. Dave was yelling, trying to pry the lid open, but it was no use. The trunk was too strong, too powerful. I could feel it, like a living thing, coiling around my arm, pulling me in. "Get out! Get out!" Dave shouted, his face pale with fear. "Let it go, man. Let it go." But I couldn't. I was in too deep. And then, just as suddenly as it had grabbed me, the trunk released. I stumbled back, clutching my arm, my heart pounding in my chest. "What the hell was that?" Dave gasped, his eyes wide with terror. I looked at the trunk, its lid now firmly shut, the padlock somehow back in place. My arm was throbbing, but more than that, I felt something else. a presence, a darkness that seemed to linger in the air, wrapping around us like a shroud. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We need to leave. Now." We didn't take anything with us. We just ran, stumbling down the stairs, through the cluttered rooms, and out the front door. We didn't stop until we were back in the truck, the mansion looming behind us like a silent, watchful sentinel. I don't remember much about the drive back. My mind was racing, my thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. What the hell had just happened? What was in that trunk? I wish I could say that was the end of it, that we left the mansion and never looked back. But that would be a lie. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the trunk, its dark, gaping maw pulling me in. I could still feel it, like a phantom limb, the cold grip of its unseen depths clinging to me. And then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a faint whisper, like a breath against my ear. "Come back." I jolted awake, my heart pounding. The room was dark, the shadows long and twisted. I could feel it, that same presence, lurking just out of sight, waiting. I knew then that it wasn't over. The trunk had taken something from me, something I couldn't get back. And it wanted more. I tried to ignore it, tried to push the memory away, but the whispers kept coming, night after night, calling me back to the mansion, back to the attic, back to the trunk. I don't know how much longer I can resist. I can feel it, that pull, growing stronger every day. It's like the trunk is calling to me, drawing me in, deeper and deeper into its darkness. And I'm afraid that one day I won't be able to resist. One day I'll go back, and when I do, I don't think I'll come out again. I've been a clown for over a decade, performing at children's parties, local fairs, and even a few private events for rich folks with eccentric tastes. It's a strange job, I'll admit, but it's what I'm good at, making people laugh, that is. The costumes, the makeup, the oversized shoes, all part of the persona. But the masks, those were always my favorite part. I started collecting masks the moment I got into this profession. You'd think, being a clown, that the masks would all be goofy or friendly, but no. My collection veered into the bizarre, and if I'm being honest, downright unsettling. I never thought much of it, though. It was just part of the job, right? A mix of art and memorabilia. But lately, something's been different. It all started about a month ago. I was in my dressing room, getting ready for a gig, and as usual, I checked on my collection. They were all hung neatly on the wall. I had about 30 masks by then, painted faces frozen in expressions of joy, anger, sadness, and everything in between. I'd always felt a certain connection to them, like they were old friends watching over me. That day, though, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Everything seemed the same, until I walked back into the room after grabbing a drink. One of the masks, a grotesque smiling face with a crack running through the forehead, was different. The smile. It was wider than I remembered, almost like it had been stretched. I blinked, staring at it. Was it always like that? I didn't think so. But I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The performance had worn me out, that was all. Clowning can do that to you, I reasoned. I shrugged it off and left. The next day, though, the same thing happened. I stepped out of the room for just a moment, and when I returned, another mask had changed. This time, it was one of my favorites, a sorrowful face with hollow eyes. But now, the eyes weren't hollow. They were wide open, like they were staring right at me. I backed out of the room, my heart racing. It couldn't be real, right? I'd been collecting these masks for years, and they'd never done anything like this before. It was absurd to even consider. But the more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. Each time I left the room, I would come back to find another mask different. The expressions became more animated, smirks turned to sneers, frowns to sobs, and the eyes. They'd followed me. I swear they did. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but deep down I knew something was wrong. Yet it wasn't until the night I found the first new mask that I really began to lose it. I hadn't bought a new mask in months, yet there it was, hanging right in the middle of the collection. I didn't recognize it at all. It was a blank face, pale and featureless, but somehow it felt more terrifying than any of the others. I didn't touch it. I didn't even want to look at it. Instead, I ran. For days, I avoided the room, but avoiding it didn't help. The masks haunted my thoughts. I'd lie awake at night, imagining their eyes, those twisted expressions watching me from behind the door. But I couldn't bring myself to go back in there. I was too scared of what I might find next. Then, one night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I had to see what was happening. Grabbing a flashlight, I crept into the dressing room, hoping, praying that the masks would be normal, that I was losing my mind and nothing more. But when I opened the door, there were more masks. They weren't just hanging on the wall anymore. They were scattered across the floor, propped up on my makeup table, and even stacked in the corner. Dozens of them. I couldn't even count how many, but they were all different, faces I'd never seen before, each more grotesque than the last. I backed up, my heart pounding. This was impossible. I hadn't added any new masks to the collection, yet here they were, filling the room. As I turned to leave, I heard a creak from behind me. Slowly, I turned back, my flashlight flickering over the walls, and then I saw it. The blank mask. It was no longer featureless. It had eyes now, eyes that stared directly at me. Its mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, and the expression was one of pure malice. It wasn't just a mask anymore. It was alive, watching me. I stumbled backward, feeling my breath catch in my throat. I had to get out of there. I had to leave. But as I reached for the door, I felt a cold, bony hand on my shoulder. I screamed, jerking away, but there was nothing there. Just the masks, grinning and sneering, their faces shifting before my eyes. Panicked, I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. But as I fled down the hallway, I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. I stopped, my pulse racing, and turned back to the door. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. And then, the door began to creak open on its own. I ran. I didn't stop until I was out of the house, gasping for air in the middle of the street. My neighbors must have thought I'd lost my mind, standing there in my clown makeup at 3 a.m. But I didn't care. All I knew was that I couldn't go back in there, not with those things in the house. I checked into a motel that night, too afraid to even think about going back. But the next morning, I knew I had to face it. I couldn't leave my life behind. I had to confront whatever was happening. So, I returned. Slowly, cautiously, I stepped inside the house. The air was thick with a strange heaviness, but I forced myself to walk toward the dressing room. The door was ajar, just like I'd left it. But when I pushed it open, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The room was empty. No masks, no makeup, no costumes. Just bare walls and a single chair in the middle of the room. And on that chair was the blank mask. Only now it had my face. I stared at it, unable to move. The mask was identical to me, every line, every wrinkle, even the makeup I'd worn the night before. It was as if the mask had absorbed my likeness, and I was looking into some twisted version of myself. I backed away, but as I did, I felt the room grow colder. The walls seemed to close in, and suddenly, I wasn't alone. The other masks, the ones that had disappeared, they were there, floating in the air around me, their twisted faces grinning and leering as they circled closer. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room spun, the walls tightening around me, and I knew I was trapped. The masks weren't just masks anymore. They were alive, and they were coming for me. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the blank mask, now fully transformed into my face, smiling that terrible wide grin. And then nothing. Now I'm here. I don't know where here is, but it's cold, dark, and endless. I can't move, I can't scream, and all I can see are the masks, floating around me in this black void. Every time I blink, another mask joins the collection. They're all here now, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all wearing faces they've stolen, including mine. And soon, I fear, they'll come for you too. I never thought much of the job at first. Code breaking had been my thing ever since I was a kid, the thrill of solving puzzles, unlocking hidden meanings. It was like chasing ghosts. But then I got the email. No name, no subject line, just a set of numbers. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. Random spam, I thought. But curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. The numbers stared back at me, as if daring me to make sense of them. 1734 to 89 76 23. I chuckled. Looked simple enough. probably just a cipher or a poorly scrambled message. I copied the numbers onto my notepad, ready to get to work. But every time I started, something strange happened. The numbers moved. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I'd look at the paper, blink, and the sequence would shift. 34 was suddenly in the middle, 76 at the end. No way, I muttered, flipping the page over. Maybe it was a trick my eyes were playing on me. I started again, this time more carefully, scribbling down the numbers exactly as I saw them. 17, 34, 2, 89, 76, 23. I looked away for just a second to grab my pen, and when I glanced back, the numbers had rearranged again. 23, 2, 34, 17, 89, 76. I stared at them. My heart started to race. This wasn't possible. Numbers don't move on their own. They're static, solid, they stay. But no matter how many times I wrote them down, they shifted every time I looked away. I felt a knot tightening in my chest, but I refused to give in. Maybe it was some kind of prank, some cleverly disguised algorithm. My logical brain fought the creeping unease, even though deep down I knew something was wrong. For hours, I tried to solve the shifting code. I ran it through every decryption tool I knew, but nothing worked. And worse, the longer I stared at the numbers, the more I felt like they were watching me. It was irrational, I know. But every time they rearranged, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were doing it for me, like the numbers were alive and taunting me. Then the dream started. At first, they were blurry, half-forgotten fragments when I woke up. But one night, it became clearer. I was in a dark room, and in front of me was a chalkboard covered in numbers, the same ones that had been haunting me. But in the dream, the numbers glowed, shifting and twisting on their own, like they had a will of their own. There was a figure in the room. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their presence. It felt heavy, cold, like they were breathing down my neck. "Solve it," the voice whispered, so close to my ear that it made my skin crawl. "I'm trying." I shouted, but the numbers kept shifting faster and faster, twisting into shapes that no longer made sense. The chalkboard filled up, numbers scrolling across every inch of space until there was no room left. And then everything went black. I woke up drenched in sweat. My room was dark, but I felt that same presence lingering in the air. I checked my phone, hoping it was all in my head, but there was another email. More numbers. 45, 67, 12, 9, 38, 54. I tried to ignore it, but the pull was too strong. I had to crack it, had to know what these numbers meant. I barely left my desk after that. Every attempt to solve the code was met with frustration. The patterns would change the moment I thought I had something. The numbers twisted, rearranged themselves, almost laughing at me. I became obsessed, spending every waking moment scribbling notes, scouring the internet for answers, and calling in every favor I could. But nothing worked. Days turned into weeks. My mind started playing tricks on me. Sometimes I'd hear whispers in the dead of night, faint but unmistakable. And every time I'd wake up, there would be more numbers waiting for me. It was like they were following me, invading every part of my life. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped answering calls. All I could focus on were those cursed numbers. And the dreams, they got worse. The figure in the shadows grew closer every time, their voice clearer, more insistent. "You'll never stop until you know." I couldn't argue. They were right. I had to solve it. One night, after days of no sleep, I saw it, the pattern. It was fleeting, barely there, but I knew I'd crack something. My fingers trembled as I pieced the numbers together, trying to hold onto the logic before it slipped away again. But then, everything changed. The numbers no longer shifted. They stopped, solid and fixed, as if they'd finally given me the answer. But it wasn't what I expected. They formed a date. 12/3/2023. I stared at it, my mind blank. What did it mean? Was it a future event? Something from the past? Suddenly, I felt a cold rush of air, like a door had opened behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing there. The lights flickered, the room seemed darker, and then I heard it, the voice. Louder now, clearer, "It's coming." My heart pounded in my chest as I scrambled to my computer, trying to search for any connection to the date, anything that could explain the numbers. But there was nothing. Then the power cut out. The room plunged into darkness, and I was left staring at the dim glow of my phone. The numbers were there again, rearranged, spelling out something new. Run. A chill shot down my spine. I stood up so fast, the chair toppled over behind me. I could feel that presence again, closer than ever before. It wasn't just watching, it was here. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and ran out of the apartment, my mind racing. But the numbers didn't stop. Every step I took, every street I crossed, I saw them. On billboards, on license plates, even on the sidewalk. They were everywhere, shifting, changing, warning me. And then I saw the figure. It stood at the end of the street, barely visible in the shadows, but I knew it was watching me. My heart raced as I turned to run the other way, but no matter where I went, it was always there. It didn't follow me, but it didn't have to. The numbers were closing in on me, suffocating me. I don't know how long I ran. Hours, maybe days. But eventually, I found myself back where it all began. My apartment door creaked open as I stepped inside, exhausted and defeated. The numbers were waiting for me on the wall, glowing faintly in the darkness. 12/3/2023. My time was up. I collapsed onto the floor, too tired to fight anymore. The numbers blurred before my eyes as the figure stepped out of the shadows. This time, I could see its face. It was me. You shouldn't have tried to solve it, the voice whispered. And then everything went black. I remember when I first started selling old maps. It wasn't a glamorous job, but there was something comforting about it. I'd set up my little stall on the corner of Elm and Pine, a quiet spot in the city. People passing by would glance at the maps, occasionally stop to browse, and sometimes even buy one. Each map had its own story, forgotten trails, ancient cities, places people would never visit, yet they found something magical in holding a piece of the world in their hands. One day, something strange happened. Among the usual stack of maps, I noticed one I hadn't seen before. It was faded, more worn than the rest, and the paper felt old, like it was crumbling just at the touch. The strangest thing, though, was the layout. It showed a city I didn't recognize. The streets had names that were unfamiliar, and there was this eerie, winding river cutting through the middle of it. The more I looked at it, the more unsettled I felt. At first, I thought maybe it was just an old, forgotten place, but none of the locations made sense. I tried searching for some of the street names on my phone, but nothing came up. Not even a trace of this place existed online. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just a rare map of some abandoned town. That would make it valuable, right? A rare find. Someone would definitely pay good money for it. I added it to the pile on my stall, expecting someone to ask about it. But no one did. People glanced at the maps, even bought a few, but no one ever so much as picked up the strange one. It was as if they didn't even see it. Days went by, and that eerie map just sat there, untouched. I began to feel uneasy. It wasn't just the fact that no one noticed it, it was how it seemed to stare back at me. Every time I glanced over at my stall, my eyes would be drawn to it. The streets, the river, the strange markings, it felt like it was waiting for something or someone. Eventually, I got tired of it. I decided to throw it away. I didn't need some weird, creepy map haunting my stall, especially one that wasn't selling. So I crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash bin behind my stand. I felt a small sense of relief as I watched the crinkled paper disappear. But the next morning, when I set up my stall, the map was back. It was just sitting there, neatly unfolded, as if it had never left. My heart skipped a beat. I was sure I had thrown it out. There was no way someone could have put it back without me noticing. I didn't know what to think, so I did it again. I threw it away, this time in a public trash can down the street. The next day, it reappeared. This went on for days. Every time I tried to get rid of it, the map would just reappear on my stall. I even tried burning it once. I watched as the edges blackened and curled, the flames licking at the paper. I was sure that was the end of it, but the next morning, there it was again, without a single scorch mark. I started to lose sleep over it. I couldn't stop thinking about the map. It haunted my dreams. I'd see myself walking through those unfamiliar streets, the river always nearby, winding through the city like a snake. In every dream, I would get lost, wandering through alleys that seemed to twist and turn in ways that defied logic. And no matter how hard I tried, I could never find my way out. One night, after another failed attempt to throw the map away, I decided to take a closer look. Maybe there was something I was missing. I spread it out on the table, studying every inch of it. That's when I noticed something new. There were tiny red marks on certain buildings. I was sure they hadn't been there before. Curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't help but wonder what those marks meant. So I grabbed a magnifying glass and examined them closely. Each red mark looked like a tiny X, as if someone had carefully placed them there, like a target. The more I looked, the more I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I had the sinking feeling that these weren't just random marks, they were significant. The next day, something changed. A man approached my stall. He was older, wearing a long coat and a fedora that shadowed most of his face. His eyes, though, were sharp, almost too sharp, as if they could see right through me. He didn't look at the other maps. He walked straight to the strange one, picked it up, and smiled. "How much for this one?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. I hesitated. For the first time in weeks, someone had acknowledged the map. I didn't know what to say. It's not for sale," I stammered. He looked up at me, his smile fading. "Everything has a price. You just don't know it yet." Without another word, he turned and walked away, the map still in his hand. I watched him go, unable to move, my mind racing. He had taken it. I should have been relieved, but instead, I felt a deep, gnawing fear. What had I just done? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the man and the map, the way he had looked at it like he knew something I didn't. As the hours dragged on, I found myself pacing the small apartment, trying to shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. And then, round midnight, I heard it, a knock on the door. Soft, deliberate, as if whoever was on the other side knew I was awake. I opened the door, heart pounding. No one was there. But on the ground, lying neatly folded, was the map. My hands trembled as I picked it up. This time, the red marks had changed. They weren't just on buildings anymore. They were scattered across the streets, leading in a path that seemed eerily familiar. My breath caught in my throat as I realized why. It was leading to my apartment. Panicking, I tried to throw it out the window, but it wouldn't budge from my grip. It clung to me like a second skin, as if the map had become part of me. Desperate, I tried tearing it apart, but the paper was unnaturally strong. No matter how hard I pulled, it refused to rip. The red marks kept moving, rearranging themselves, drawing closer and closer to my location. It was as if the map was alive, shifting and changing, plotting something I couldn't understand. Then I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from just outside the door. I froze. Someone or something was standing there. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. Instead, I backed away, heart pounding in my chest, and looked at the map again. The red marks had stopped, right at my apartment building. And then the knocking started. It was soft at first, just like before. But it grew louder, more insistent. I could feel it vibrating through the floor, echoing in my chest. The door creaked open by itself. I didn't want to look, but something made me turn my head. There, standing in the doorway, was the man from earlier, holding the map. His eyes gleamed with something dark and terrible. "I told you," he said softly. "Everything has a price." The next morning, my stall was empty. The vendor across the street said I had disappeared overnight. But if you ask him, he'll tell you one more thing. There's a new map on my stall now, one that no one can seem to get rid of. I've been a personal trainer for a while now, and in that time, I've seen all kinds of clients. Eager ones, lazy ones, those that stick to the routine, and those who treat it like a suggestion. But no one has ever unsettled me the way Marcus did. The first time he walked into the gym, I didn't think much of him. He was just another guy in his early 30s, slim, but not in shape. He wanted to put on muscle, get stronger, pretty standard stuff. We booked him in for 3 sessions a week, and that's when things started getting weird. It didn't happen right away. At first, the sessions were normal. He asked questions about the workouts, about his form, and I gave him advice. He was dedicated, and I respected that. But by the 3rd week, something shifted. It was a Thursday morning, and I remember walking over to the dumbbells, ready to demonstrate a new exercise for him. A clean press combo we hadn't done before. Just as I opened my mouth to explain, Marcus moved ahead of me. He picked up the exact weights I had in mind, assumed perfect form, and went straight into the exercise like it was second nature. I raised an eyebrow. "Have you done this one before?" I asked, genuinely curious. He shook his head. "No, but I figured this is what you'd have me do next." I laughed it off, thinking it was a lucky guess. People pick up patterns after a while. It wasn't that strange. But then it happened again the next day and the day after that. Marcus always knew what exercise was coming. I didn't have to say anything. He was already moving on to the next rep, the next set, the next move, as if he had memorized the entire session beforehand. It was eerie. I started testing him. On Monday, I tried to change the routine on the fly, throwing in exercises I had never shown him. Yet, without missing a beat, he would anticipate every single change. I'd walk toward the leg press, and he was already adjusting the machine before I even reached it. It was as if he had been inside my head, reading my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort that settled in my stomach. Something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. One evening after a session, I sat Marcus down in the break area, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. "How are you feeling?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "You seem to know the exercises a little too well. Are you doing extra research or something?" He smiled, but there was something off about it, like it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I don't know," he said, shrugging. "It's like I've done this before, you know? Like déjà vu." Déjà vu. That was the word I had been avoiding in my head. But this was more than that. Déjà vu is a momentary flicker, a brief sensation. Marcus was living it, session after session, every moment playing out like it had happened 100 times before. As the weeks went on, the eeriness thickened. I couldn't get a read on him anymore. His movements were mechanical, too precise. He stopped talking as much during sessions, focusing only on the exercises, as if nothing else in the world existed. No matter how much I tried to change up the routine, Marcus always knew what was coming. Then came the breaking point. It was a Friday evening. The gym was unusually quiet, with just a few stragglers finishing their workouts. Marcus had booked the last session of the day, and I had decided to stay late. There was a strange tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. I led him over to the squat rack, deciding to throw something completely random into the mix, something we had never done before. As I approached the rack, Marcus was already there, adjusting the barbell to the exact weight I had in mind. My skin prickled. "How did you know I was going toe?" "You were going to tell me to squat," he interrupted, his voice flat. "Marcus, this isn't normal," I said, stepping back. No one should be able to predict what's next like this. He didn't respond. Instead, he stood up straight, eyes locking with mine. For the first time, I noticed how dull his expression had become. There was no spark of energy, no excitement for the progress he was making. Just emptiness. "I don't know why," he said after a long pause, "but it's like I've lived this moment already. Over and over." That sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to call off the session, tell him we were done for the day, but something in the way he looked at me kept me frozen in place. There was something far darker behind his eyes now, something I hadn't noticed before. "I've seen the end too," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I know how this session ends." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice coming out weaker than I intended. Marcus didn't answer right away. He turned toward the mirror that lined the gym wall and stared at his reflection for a long, agonizing moment. Then he turned back to me, his face pale. "You're in danger," he said quietly. I felt my heart pound in my chest. "What are you?" "It's not me," he interrupted, his voice growing frantic. "It's something else. It's been following me, living these sessions with me, over and over again." Before I could respond, the lights flickered above us, the gym falling into a brief, unnatural darkness. When they came back on, Marcus was standing closer to me than he had been before, too close. "I can't stop it," he said, his voice hollow now. "It wants you." I backed away, my legs trembling. "Marcus, what the hell is going on?" But he didn't say anything more. Instead, his body seemed to convulse, his muscles twitching violently, and he let out a guttural sound that echoed through the empty gym. It wasn't human. The Marcus I knew was gone. Suddenly, the gym lights flickered again, and the air turned icy cold. I could feel something watching me, something far more terrifying than Marcus had ever been. My breath hitched as shadows danced along the walls, growing thicker and darker until they seemed to press in on me. Marcus, or whatever was left of him, smiled in a way that made my blood run cold. "You can't escape it," he whispered. I didn't either. And just like that, he collapsed to the floor, his body still and lifeless. But I didn't dare move toward him. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot as the darkness in the room seemed to throb with malevolent energy. I couldn't explain what had just happened. All I knew was that I had to leave, but as I turned to the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang, leaving me trapped inside. The shadows grew stronger, pulling toward me like they were alive, and I felt a chill settle into my bones. I should have run, should have screamed for help, but it was too late. The moment Marcus's lifeless body twitched again, I knew I would never leave that gym. Because this time, I wasn't just living a session with Marcus. I was living it with whatever had been following him all along. And now it had me. I've always had a thing for caves. Something about the isolation, the dark, the feeling of being the only person to have ever stepped inside. It's a rush. So when I heard about this cave, a cave that supposedly went on forever, I couldn't resist. No one knew much about it. The locals just called it the Endless Hole. Sounds ridiculous, right? But I didn't care. I had to see it for myself. I packed my gear, ropes, helmet, flashlight, and my trusty notebook for mapping. I didn't know how much ground I'd cover, but I wanted to chart as much as possible. Mapping is kind of my thing. It gives me control in a world that's unpredictable. I like knowing where I've been and where I'm going. The entrance to the cave was tucked behind a dense patch of trees, barely visible unless you were looking for it. It was unmarked, untouched by tourists, and, judging by the overgrowth, forgotten. Perfect. The air got colder as I descended, the light from the outside quickly fading until only my headlamp pierced the blackness. The walls were damp, slick with condensation. I checked my map, marked the entrance, and started moving. The first few passages were uneventful, narrow but manageable. The kind of cave you've seen 1,000 times if you're in this line of work. After about an hour, things started to get strange. I took a right turn at a fork in the tunnel, my flashlight sweeping over the walls. When I came to the next intersection, I took out my map and started to mark it down. But the path I had just come from wasn't where I had drawn it. I couldn't be sure, but the angle seemed off, like the tunnel had shifted somehow. I shrugged it off. Mapping errors happen all the time underground. Except it wasn't an error. I kept moving, diving deeper into the cave. The walls began to close in, and the air grew heavy, almost too thick to breathe. Every time I reached a new junction, I pulled out the map. And every time, something was off. The paths didn't line up. Tunnels that should have been on my left were on my right. No matter how many corrections I made, the cave seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. At first, I thought I was losing it. I double-checked every turn, but nothing made sense. I tried backtracking to the entrance, but the way I came from no longer existed. The cave had changed. I swear it had. It wasn't panic yet, not quite, but a prickling unease crept down my spine. I pressed on, hoping to find something familiar, some kind of anchor point to ground me. But the further I went, the more it felt like the cave was pulling me in, guiding me. The passageways grew narrower, the ceiling lower. I had to crawl through some parts, squeezing my body into gaps that felt too tight for comfort. Every inch I moved forward, I could hear the distant drip of water echoing through the tunnels. A steady, maddening rhythm that never seemed to get closer. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time doesn't work the same down there. I couldn't tell anymore. My map was useless at this point. I gave up trying to chart the passages because they never stayed the same. I'd go left, and the next time I checked, the left would become right or worse, just disappear altogether. And then there was the sound. It started as a faint whisper, like wind passing through a crack in the rock. But there was no wind this deep. I knew that much. The whisper grew louder the deeper I went, and soon I realized it wasn't wind. It was voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They weren't saying anything I could understand, just low, guttural murmurs that vibrated through the walls. I should have turned back. I knew that, but there was no back anymore, only forward. I descended further, crawling on my belly through tunnels that seemed to shrink as I moved. I was deep, so deep that my flashlight was starting to dim. I cursed myself for not bringing more batteries, but then I heard something. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, echoing behind me. I froze. My heart raced as I strained to listen. The steps were getting closer, slow but steady, like someone or something was following me. I whipped around, shining my light down the tunnel. Nothing, just empty darkness. I was about to turn back when I saw it. A figure just at the edge of the light, standing still. Too still. My breath caught in my throat, and I fumbled for my radio, but of course no signal. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. I scrambled forward, pushing myself deeper into the cave. I had no other choice. The passages continued to twist and change around me, leading me further down into the earth. The voices grew louder, the footsteps never far behind. At one point, I reached a cavern, a large open space with a high ceiling that vanished into the shadows above. I thought maybe this was it, the center of the cave, the place where the paths would stop shifting. But I was wrong. The walls of the cavern began to pulse, almost like they were breathing. The air thickened, filled with the scent of damp earth and something else, something rotten. And then the ground gave way beneath me. I tumbled into the blackness, falling for what felt like an eternity. When I finally hit the ground, pain shot through my legs. I could barely stand, but I forced myself up, clutching at the walls for support. My flashlight flickered, its last burst of power before going out completely. I was in the dark now, truly, utterly blind. The voices were deafening, swirling around me like a storm. I reached out, trying to feel my way through the cave, but it was no use. The walls were gone. There was nothing, just a vast, empty void. I don't know how long I wandered in that darkness, hours maybe or days. My legs were weak, my throat parched. I was losing my grip on reality. And then I saw it. A faint glow, far off in the distance. Hope surged through me. Maybe it was the way out. I limped toward it, ignoring the voices that now screamed in my ears. The light grew brighter, illuminating the cave walls again. But when I reached the source, my heart sank. It wasn't an exit, it was me. I stood in front of a figure, an exact replica of myself, holding a flashlight, staring back at me with hollow eyes. It smiled, a grotesque, twisted grin that sent chills down my spine. The cave had led me here, not to save me, but to show me my fate. I tried to run, but the ground beneath me cracked open. I fell again, deeper this time, into a pit of darkness. The voices swallowed me whole, and the last thing I saw was my own face, smiling as I plunged into the abyss. No one ever comes back from the endless hole. And now I understand why. I never considered myself superstitious. I've spent years in the wine business, trusting my palate more than anything else. There's a certain logic to tasting. Understanding the history in every step, the vineyards, the regions, the weather, the aging process. It's science and art intertwined. So, when I came across a bottle I'd never heard of, I chalked it up to a gap in my knowledge. It happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in the wine cellar of a small family-owned vineyard in the French countryside. I was there to assess their collection for an upcoming auction. The owner, an old man named Henry, led me down a narrow staircase into the cool, dimly lit cellar, which smelled of aged wood and damp stone. "Here's where we keep the good stuff," he said, a sly smile creeping onto his face. Rows and rows of dusty bottles lined the shelves, most of which I recognized immediately. Bordeaux, Burgundy, Rhone, classic French wines that any connoisseur would salivate over. But something else caught my eye. Tucked away in the far corner was a single bottle, older than the others, with no label. "What's that one?" I asked, pointing to the mystery bottle. Henry's face paled, his usual smug confidence draining away. That bottle shouldn't be here." Curiosity got the better of me. Why not? He hesitated before saying, "It's not from our vineyard, or from anywhere I know. It's been in the cellar for as long as I can remember. My father told me never to touch it." Naturally, this only made me want to try it more. Wine, especially old and rare, carries stories. But this one seemed to hold a secret I couldn't resist. Against Henry's warnings, I asked him to open the bottle. He refused. "I'll do it myself then," I said, grabbing the bottle and feeling its cold, smooth surface. There was no branding, no markings. Nothing to identify where it came from or who made it. Henry stepped back, eyes wide, muttering something under his breath. I didn't care. The cork came off easily, and the smell hit me, rich, deep, and unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was inviting yet unsettling. I poured a small amount into my glass, swirling it gently. Then I took a sip. For a moment, it was pure bliss. The wine tasted like perfection, smooth and balanced, with hints of berries and oak. But then something strange happened. Images began flooding my mind. Memories, but not my memories. I saw a child running through a field of tall grass, laughing. A mother calling out from a distance. I blinked, trying to shake it off. "Are you all right?" Henry asked, his voice distant. I nodded, though I wasn't sure. "Yeah, I'm fine. It's just unusual." I took another sip, and more memories rushed in. This time, it was a wedding. A groom holding his bride's hand, their faces blurry, but I could feel the love and warmth between them. But again, it wasn't my memory. "What is this?" I whispered, staring at the glass in disbelief. Henry said nothing, his face a mask of fear. Against my better judgment, I took a third sip. This time, the memories weren't pleasant. A dark figure standing at the edge of a cliff. The wind howling, waves crashing violently below. I felt a sense of dread, like something terrible was about to happen. I put the glass down, my heart racing. This wine, it's showing me things, but they're not mine. Henry shook his head slowly. "I warned you. That bottle has been cursed for generations. Anyone who drinks from it, they experience the lives of others." "But why?" I asked, my voice trembling. "No one knows. Some say it was made by a man who wanted to preserve memories, to keep them alive forever. But something went wrong. Now the bottle shows you not just memories, but the most painful moments of the people who once lived." I looked at the bottle, suddenly feeling sick to my stomach. How do I stop it? Henry's eyes darkened. "You can't. Once you've started, the memories don't stop. They'll keep coming, until they take over." I stumbled back, the room spinning. More memories surged into my mind. This time of a man being chased through the woods, his breath ragged, fear gripping his every step. Then another, a woman crying over a coffin, rain pouring down around her. I could barely stand. I clutched my head, trying to push the memories out, but they kept coming faster and faster. I couldn't tell where I ended and these other lives began. "I have to get out of here," I gasped, pushing past Henry. He didn't stop me. He just watched as I fled up the stairs, his face grim, as if he'd seen it all before. Outside, the world seemed brighter, too bright. I staggered to my car, the memories swirling in my head, blending with my own. I could feel them clawing at my mind, trying to take over, trying to erase me. The drive back to my hotel was a blur. By the time I arrived, I wasn't sure who I was anymore. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands, wondering if they were really mine. The memories wouldn't stop. Every time I closed my eyes, I was someone else, living their lives, feeling their pain, their joy, their love, their loss. I opened my eyes, hoping the nightmares would fade, but they didn't. And then I heard a voice, soft, whispering, calling my name. I turned, expecting to see someone in the room, but there was no one, just me and the memories. The next few days were torture. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Every moment was filled with the lives of others. I tried to remember my own life, but it was slipping away, piece by piece. The memories were erasing me. I went back to the vineyard, desperate for answers. But when I arrived, the cellar was empty. Henry was gone. The vineyard looked abandoned, like no one had been there for years. Panic set in. Had I imagined it all? Was I losing my mind? But then I saw the bottle, sitting on a table in the middle of the cellar, waiting for me. The sight of it filled me with both dread and longing. I knew I shouldn't, but part of me wanted to finish it, to see where the memories led. I picked up the bottle, my hands shaking. There was only one way to stop the memories from torturing me. I had to embrace them. With a final, trembling breath, I took the last sip. The memories came rushing in, faster and stronger than before. But this time, I didn't fight them. I let them consume me. And as the last of my own memories faded away, I realized something horrifying. I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. I've always been a bit skeptical about kids' toys. They're usually too loud, too colorful, or just too annoying to have around. But the train set Max got for his 8th birthday seemed different. It was a gift from his Uncle Jerry, who lived in some remote part of Europe, and it looked expensive, almost vintage. Max had always been fascinated by trains, so it wasn't surprising he was glued to it from the moment he unwrapped it. The set was intricate, with tiny houses, trees, and even miniature people. What caught my eye, though, was how similar it looked to our own neighborhood. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the more I looked, the more convinced I became. It was uncanny. There was our house, the Wilsons next door, and even Mr. Grady's old, rusty car parked in front of his driveway. Max was thrilled. He spent hours every day playing with it, moving the trains around the tracks, making up stories about the tiny people who lived in the tiny houses. I figured it was just a phase and let him be. But then things started to get weird. One morning, I was walking past the Wilsons' house on my way to the store when I noticed something odd. Their mailbox, which had always been at the end of their driveway, was now standing crookedly in their front yard. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe they were doing some landscaping or something. But that evening, when I checked the toy train set, I saw the same mailbox standing crookedly in front of the miniature Wilsons' house. "Hey, Max," I asked, trying to keep my tone casual, "did you move this mailbox here?" Max looked up from his coloring book, puzzled. "No, Mom. It's always been there." I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I was overthinking things. But as the days went by, more things began to change in the neighborhood, and every time, the same changes appeared in the toy set. First, it was Mrs. Carter's rose bush, which had been in full bloom last week, suddenly withered and dry. Then, the Robinsons' blue SUV, which magically turned red overnight. Each time, the train set reflected the changes perfectly. I started paying more attention to Max's playtime, watching him as he moved the trains around. One afternoon, I saw him gently lift the tiny figure of Mr. Grady out of his tiny car and place him on the tracks. I laughed nervously. "What are you doing, sweetie?" Max looked up at me, his expression serious. Mr. Grady was being mean to the tiny people, so he has to wait for the train. I didn't think much of it at the time. Kids have wild imaginations, right? But the next day, we heard that Mr. Grady had been in a terrible accident. He'd been hit by a train while crossing the tracks just outside of town. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was a terrible coincidence, but that's all it was, right? I started avoiding the train set. I didn't want to see what other changes it might predict. But Max was obsessed. He played with it constantly, talking to the tiny people, telling them stories, moving them around the little town. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know if I was going crazy. I sat down next to Max as he played, watching him place the tiny Robinsons in their car and push it down the street. "Why do you like this toy so much, Max?" I asked, trying to sound curious, not scared. Max didn't look up. "Because they listen to me. They do what I say." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to keep my voice steady. "What do you mean, they listen to you?" Max finally looked up, his eyes wide and innocent. "When I tell them to move, they move. When I tell them to stop, they stop. And when they're bad," he paused, glancing at the train set, "I make them go away." A chill settled over me. "Go away? What do you mean?" Max shrugged. "They just go away, Mom, like Mr. Grady." I felt like I was going to be sick. I had to do something. That night, after Max went to bed, I took the train set down to the basement. I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but I knew I had to get it out of the house. The basement was dark and musty, filled with old boxes and forgotten memories. I shoved the train set into a corner and covered it with an old sheet. I felt relieved as I walked back upstairs. Maybe now things would go back to normal. But they didn't. The next morning, Max was inconsolable. He tore through the house, screaming and crying, looking for his train set. I tried to calm him down, but he was hysterical. He kept saying that the tiny people needed him, that they were scared without him. I tried to explain that the train set was gone, that it wasn't coming back, but he wouldn't listen. Finally, I had no choice. I went down to the basement and brought it back up. Max's eyes lit up the moment he saw it, and he hugged the box tightly. "Thank you, Mummy," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you." I watched him set up the train set again, his hands trembling with excitement. He placed the tiny people back in their places, whispering to them, calming them down. I felt a deep sense of dread settle in my stomach. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't take the train set away again, but I couldn't leave it with him either. And then things got worse. One evening, I walked into the living room to find Max holding the tiny figure of me. My heart skipped a beat as I watched him place it in front of the oncoming train. "Max, what are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and innocent. "You didn't listen, Mommy. You took them away, and they were scared. I have to make sure you don't do it again." I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. I watched in horror as he pushed the train forward, the tiny figure of me disappearing beneath the wheels. I felt a sudden pain in my chest, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. I stumbled back, clutching my chest, gasping for air. Max watched me with wide eyes, his expression curious. I could see the confusion in his eyes, like he didn't understand what was happening. I managed to stagger to the phone and dial 911 before collapsing on the floor. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Max, standing over me, the tiny figure of me in his hand. I woke up in the hospital. They said it was a heart attack, that I was lucky to be alive. But I didn't feel lucky. All I could think about was the train set and Max and the tiny figure of me crushed beneath the toy train. They kept me in the hospital for a few days just to be safe. My sister took Max to stay with her while I recovered. I tried to tell them about the train set, about what Max had done, but no one believed me. They said it was the stress, that I was overreacting, that I needed to rest. When I'd finally got home, the train set was gone. My sister said she'd thrown it away, that it was too old and broken to keep. I felt a strange sense of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by a deep, gnawing fear. Max was different after that. He was quiet, withdrawn. He didn't talk about the train set, didn't ask for it. But sometimes I'd catch him looking at me, his eyes dark and unreadable, and I'd feel that same pressure in my chest, that same sense of dread. I don't know what happened to the train set. Maybe it really is gone, lost forever. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of a train whistle, and I wonder if it's really over. If Max has really let go, or if he's just waiting for the right moment to make another change. And every time I think that, I can't help but wonder, am I next? When I moved into the old house on Cherry Street, it felt like a fresh start. It was a small place with creaky floors and peeling wallpaper, but it was mine. It was the kind of house that had stories, and I wanted to make my own. Little did I know, the house had stories of its own, stories I would soon be a part of. It started on a Saturday morning, just after I'd settled in. I woke up to find a small drawer in my bedroom wall. I was sure it hadn't been there the night before. It was a little thing, barely big enough to hold a book, and I wondered how I'd missed it. Curiosity got the better of me, so I pulled it open. Inside, there was a small wooden car, a toy. It was a bit worn, with faded red paint and one missing wheel. I picked it up and examined it closely. Something about it felt familiar, like a word at the tip of your tongue that you can't quite remember. But I didn't recall ever owning a toy like this. My childhood was a blur, mostly a mix of awkward school photos and forgotten birthdays. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was left behind by a previous owner. I set the toy car aside and went about my day, not thinking much of it. The next morning, there was another drawer. This one was just below the first, blending in perfectly with the wall, as if it had always been there. I pulled it open, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't understand. Inside, I found a photograph, a picture of me as a kid, maybe 7 or 8 years old. I was standing in front of an old oak tree, grinning with a gap-toothed smile. But what sent a chill down my spine was that I didn't remember this photo being taken. I didn't even remember the tree. I stared at the photo for what felt like forever. How did this get here? I hadn't unpacked any childhood stuff, and I was sure I'd never seen this picture before. My mind was racing, searching for logical explanations. Maybe someone was playing a prank, but who? I barely knew anyone in town. I tried to brush it off again, telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation, but when I woke up the next morning to find a third drawer, my unease turned into something darker, something like fear. This drawer held a small stuffed bear, its fur matted and one eye missing. I recognized it instantly. His name was Mr. Cuddles, and I used to sleep with him every night when I was little. I hadn't seen him in decades, and I certainly hadn't brought him with me when I moved. My hands were trembling as I held the bear, memories of sleepless nights and whispered secrets flooding back. How did he get here? I spent the day tearing through the house, searching for hidden panels or any sign of who might be doing this. I checked the walls, the floors, even the ceiling. There was nothing, no holes, no secret passages, no sign of anyone else. It was like the drawers were appearing out of thin air. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps, every whisper of the wind like a voice calling my name. I lay in bed, staring at the wall, waiting for the next drawer to appear. When I finally drifted off, it was into a restless, haunted sleep. I woke up the next morning, heart pounding, and turned to the wall. There it was, the fourth drawer, neatly aligned with the others. My stomach dropped as I reached for it, dreading what I would find inside. It was a small, worn-out journal, the cover cracked and the pages yellowed with age. I flipped it open and saw my own handwriting, childish and uneven. It was a diary from when I was around 10 years old. I hadn't seen this in years. I didn't even remember keeping a diary. But there it was, filled with entries about school, my parents, and a strange shadow that used to watch me from my closet at night. I felt like I was going crazy. The shadow in the closet. I remembered being scared, but I had always thought it was just my imagination. But here it was, written in my own words, describing the fear, the sleepless nights, and how the shadow seemed to get closer and closer each time I looked. I threw the diary down and stumbled out of the room, my mind spinning. This couldn't be real. Maybe I was sleepwalking, pulling these things out of some hidden place and putting them in the drawers. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I knew that wasn't true. The drawers weren't just appearing, they were bringing my past back with them. Over the next few days, more drawers appeared. Each one contained something from my childhood: a broken slingshot, a baseball glove, a crumpled birthday card. It was like the wall was peeling away layers of my memory, digging up things I'd long forgotten or never wanted to remember. I couldn't escape it. Every night, I'd lie in bed, staring at the wall, waiting for the next drawer to appear, knowing it would bring something darker, something I wasn't ready to face. And then, one night, the wall changed. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding. The room was cold, and I felt a strange pressure, like the air was too thick. I turned on the light, and there it was, a massive drawer that took up almost the entire wall. It was different from the others, larger and older, with deep scratches across the front. My hands shook as I reached for the handle, a voice in my head screaming at me to stop. But I couldn't. I had to know what was inside. I pulled it open, and a gust of freezing air hit me. The drawer was deep, too deep, like it stretched back into the darkness forever. I leaned in, squinting, trying to see what was inside. And then I saw it, a small, trembling figure crouched in the darkness, its eyes wide and hollow, staring back at me. It was me. A younger version of me, maybe 5 or 6 years old. The boy in the drawer looked terrified, his mouth moving like he was trying to say something, but no sound came out. I stumbled back, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. But it was. The boy crawled forward, his eyes never leaving mine, his small hands reaching out like he was begging for help. I wanted to slam the drawer shut, to lock whatever this was back inside, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear and something else, recognition. The boy was me, but he wasn't just a memory. He was something I had buried deep inside, something I had locked away and forgotten. I remembered now, the dark nights, the whispers from the closet, the shadow that watched me while I slept. It wasn't just in my head, it was real, and I had tried to forget it, to make myself believe it was just a nightmare. But the wall knew. The drawers knew. They had pulled everything out, every fear, every forgotten memory, until there was nothing left to hide. The boy reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, and I felt a jolt of icy cold run through me. I tried to pull back, but I couldn't move. The boy's eyes were wide, pleading, and then he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Help me." And then I was falling into the drawer, into the darkness, the boy's hand gripping mine, pulling me down into the endless night. I screamed, but no sound came out. The walls closed in, and I was trapped, locked away in the dark, just like I had locked him away all those years ago. Now I'm here, in the drawer. I don't know how long it's been, but I know the house is still there, and the drawers are still opening. I can hear them sometimes, the creak of wood, the whisper of memories being pulled out one by one. And I know that one day, someone else will find the drawers. Someone else will open them. And when they do, I'll be waiting, in the darkness. I've been a woodworker for over 2 decades, and I thought I'd seen everything. The beauty of my craft lies in the unpredictability of nature itself, the unique grain patterns, the knots that add character, and the sense of accomplishment that comes from turning raw wood into something meaningful. But nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered that summer. It started innocently enough. I'd been commissioned to create a series of handcrafted furniture for a local gallery. They wanted something special, something that would make people stop and admire the craftsmanship. I had just received a shipment of walnut from a small lumber yard upstate. It was high-quality wood, rich and dark, with grain patterns that seemed to flow like a river. I remember the first time I noticed it, a slight shift in the grain pattern on a small offcut. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. I'd been working long hours, and fatigue can do strange things. But then it happened again and again. The grain, which had initially appeared as a series of wavy lines, now looked like it was spiraling inward, almost as if it were twisting into itself. I put the piece aside, chalking it up to my imagination. The next day, I started working on a coffee table. I chose a beautiful slab from the walnut batch. The grain was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. As I planed the surface, I noticed something peculiar. The pattern seemed to have changed slightly from the day before. The spirals I thought I'd imagined now looked like eyes, staring back at me. It was unsettling, but I shrugged it off. Wood is a living material after all. It can warp, change, and surprise you. I spent the next few days working on various pieces, chairs, a dining table, and a set of shelves. Each time, I selected a new slab, and each time, the grain seemed different from what I remembered. The changes were subtle, almost imperceptible. But by the time I finished the coffee table, I was convinced something strange was happening. The table was beautiful, perhaps the finest piece I'd ever made. But when I looked at it, I felt an odd sensation, like it didn't belong to me, like I hadn't made it. The grain pattern now resembled a face, distorted and twisted, as if trapped within the wood itself. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The face was gone, replaced by the swirling, mesmerizing pattern that had drawn me in initially. I told myself I was overworked and needed a break. The following day, I started on a pair of bookshelves. I picked 2 similar slabs from the same batch, expecting them to have complementary patterns. As I worked, I noticed something odd. The grain on one piece seemed to stretch and elongate, while the other became tighter, more compact. By the time I was done, the 2 shelves looked like they'd been made by different craftsmen, different hands. It was unsettling. I decided to take a few days off, hoping some rest would clear my mind. But when I returned to the workshop, the unease hadn't left me. I started on a rocking chair, choosing another slab from the walnut batch. This time, I paid close attention to the grain. I marked it with chalk, trying to track any changes, but no matter how much I watched, the pattern seemed to shift only when I wasn't looking directly at it. It was driving me mad. I began to obsess over the wood, checking it multiple times a day. I even set up a camera to see if I could capture the changes, but the footage showed nothing unusual. It was just wood, lying there, motionless. Yet each time I returned to the shop, the grain was different. I started talking to the wood. I know it sounds crazy, but I was desperate for answers. What do you want? I'd whisper, my hands trembling as I traced the lines with my fingers. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. My wife noticed too. She asked me if everything was all right, but how could I explain it to her? She'd think I was insane. Then one night, I had a dream. I was standing in the middle of the forest, surrounded by trees. Their trunks twisted and spiraled, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands. I walked among them, feeling their presence, their eyes watching me. I reached out to touch one, and its bark peeled away, revealing a face trapped within. It screamed silently, its eyes pleading with me. I woke up in a cold sweat, the image seared into my mind. I knew then that I couldn't use that wood anymore. I had to get rid of it. I went to the shop the next morning, determined to burn the entire batch. But when I arrived, I found the walnut pieces arranged in a circle as if someone or something had moved them. The grain patterns on each slab had shifted again, forming a series of grotesque faces, their eyes following me as I moved around the shop. Panic set in. I grabbed an axe and started chopping the slabs, splintering the wood into pieces. But as I swung the axe, I felt a force pushing back, resisting me. It was as if the wood itself was alive, fighting for survival. I swung harder, my breaths ragged and desperate. Finally, the slabs shattered, their faces screaming silently as they split apart. I thought it was over. I burned the remains, watching as the fire consumed the cursed wood. The smoke rose into the sky, thick and dark, carrying away the remnants of whatever evil had possessed those slabs. I felt a sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted from my chest. But that night, the dream returned. I was back in the forest, the twisted trees surrounding me. This time they spoke, their voices a whispering chorus that echoed through the darkness. You cannot escape us. I woke up, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I rushed to the shop, needing to see for myself that the wood was gone. But when I opened the door, I froze. The walnut batch was back, the slabs arranged in a perfect circle. The grain patterns were more twisted than ever, forming faces that seemed to sneer at me, their eyes filled with malice. I stumbled back, my mind racing. How was this possible? I had burned them. I had watched them turn to ash. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the workshop. I felt a presence, cold and malevolent, surrounding me. The faces in the wood began to move, their mouths opening in silent screams. I covered my ears, but the sound was inside my head, a cacophony of agony and rage. I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face. The wood was alive, and it wanted something from me. In a moment of clarity, I grabbed a chisel and drove it into my palm. The pain was sharp and immediate, grounding me in reality. I used the blood to draw a circle on the floor, a barrier between me and the cursed wood. The faces twisted in fury, their eyes blazing with hatred, but they couldn't cross the line. I don't know how long I stayed there, trapped in that circle. Hours? Days? Time lost all meaning. I was exhausted, my body weak and trembling. But I couldn't leave. I knew if I did, the wood would consume me, just as it had consumed the others. In the end, I made a choice. I crawled to my workbench and found a small carving knife. With trembling hands, I carved my name into the floor, a final act of defiance. Then, I plunged the knife into my chest, hoping that my blood would be enough to break the curse. As darkness closed in, I heard the voices one last time, whispering their final message. You are ours now. I died there, surrounded by the faces of the damned. But even in death, I knew the truth. The wood was cursed, and now, so was I. I've always been a rational person, the kind who rolls their eyes at ghost stories and laughs at superstitions. I live alone in a small apartment downtown, balancing my work as a graphic designer and a relatively quiet social life. My routine was predictable until those voicemails started. It all began on an ordinary Monday morning. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. Groggy and half asleep, I picked it up, expecting it to be a reminder from my calendar or a text from my mom. But instead, it was a voicemail notification. That's strange, I thought. No one leaves voicemails anymore. I tapped on it, not recognizing the number, and listened. Hey, it's me. Don't freak out. I know this sounds weird, but something's going to happen today. Be careful when you step out of the building. You'll see a black cat crossing your path. Avoid stepping on the cracked part of the sidewalk. The voice was mine. Exactly like mine, but with an eerie tone of urgency. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. How could this be? I dismissed it as some sort of prank and shrugged it off. Maybe it was some app that mimicked voices. But a tiny part of me, the part that can't help but feel unsettled in the dark, stayed wary. Later that morning, I decided to head out to the cafe around the corner, trying to push the weird voicemail out of my mind. As I stepped outside, I couldn't help but notice a black cat dart across the sidewalk, just as the voicemail had said. My heart started to race. I glanced down and saw the cracked part of the sidewalk. I hesitated, then took a wide step around it, feeling ridiculous but relieved. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to coincidence. But then it happened again. And again. The next voicemail came that evening. Hey, it's me again. Listen, I know this is hard to believe, but you're going to get a call from your boss tomorrow. Don't pick up. He's going to ask you to work on a project over the weekend. Say you're busy. Sure enough, the next day, my phone rang around noon, and it was my boss. I let it go to voicemail, my hands trembling. Later, I listened to his message. He wanted me to take on an urgent project over the weekend, but I declined, using the excuse me had given. Over the next few days, the voicemails kept coming. Each time, the warnings were more specific, more unsettling. One morning, it was about a friend who would show up unannounced, asking to crash at my place because her boyfriend had kicked her out. That happened exactly as described. Another time, it was about avoiding a specific coffee shop because there would be a gas leak. I turned the corner just in time to see fire trucks and the shop being evacuated. I couldn't deny it anymore. These were real. Somehow, I was getting voicemails from a version of myself that knew what was going to happen before it did. I stopped sleeping properly, jumping at every little sound, waiting for the next call. I tried to ignore the phone, to pretend it wasn't happening, but I couldn't. The curiosity and fear were too much. It wasn't long before the voicemails took a darker turn. Hey, it's me. You need to be careful tonight. Don't let anyone in, no matter who they say they are. Keep the lights off and don't answer the door. That night, I sat in my dark apartment, heart pounding, staring at the door. Around midnight, there was a knock. It's me, Katie. It was my best friend's voice. Open up, I forgot my key. I wanted to believe it was her, but the fear from the voicemail paralyzed me. I texted Katie and she replied immediately. I'm at home, why? I didn't move until morning. When I checked the security footage from my building, I saw a woman standing outside my door, but her face was blurred, unrecognizable. That's when I knew I was in danger, and these messages weren't just warnings, they were a lifeline. I tried to get help. I went to the police, but what could I say? That I was getting voicemails from myself? They looked at me like I was insane. I even showed them the recordings, but they just suggested I talk to a therapist. The final voicemail came on a rainy Friday evening. I had just come back from work, exhausted and jittery from lack of sleep. My phone buzzed, and I almost didn't want to look at it. But I did. Hey, it's me. This is the last time I can warn you. They're coming tonight. You need to leave. Don't pack anything, just go. Head for the old highway and don't look back. If you stay, you won't make it. My blood ran cold. Who were they? What was going to happen? I felt trapped, like a mouse in a maze with no way out. I grabbed my keys and phone and ran out of the apartment, not even bothering to lock the door. As I drove down the dark, deserted highway, my phone rang again. My own number flashed on the screen. I picked up, my heart hammering in my chest. You didn't listen. My own voice, but this time it sounded different, hollow, distant. It's too late now. They're already here. The line went dead, and my car suddenly swerved on its own. I struggled with the wheel, but it felt like something was pulling it from the other side. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw shadows moving in the backseat, shifting and twisting into shapes I couldn't comprehend. My vision blurred as panic set in. I heard my own voice whispering, echoing through the car, "You should have listened. It's all your fault." I slammed on the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt. I jumped out and ran, stumbling through the rain, my heart in my throat. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away from whatever was happening. The trees loomed around me like dark sentinels, and I could feel something watching me, something closing in. I tripped and fell, the mud cold and wet against my skin. I looked up, and there they were, shadows, dozens of them, circling around me, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows closed in, and I felt the cold seep into my bones, the darkness consuming everything. The last thing I heard was my own voice, whispering, "You were never meant to escape." And then there was nothing. The next morning, they found my car abandoned by the highway, the door open, engine still running. There was no trace of me, no sign of struggle, nothing to explain where I had gone. The only clue was my phone, lying in the passenger seat, with one final voicemail left unheard. "Hey, it's me. If you're hearing this, it's already too late." They never found me. I became just another missing person, a name on a list, a face on a flyer. But I'm still here, somewhere in the dark, waiting for the next call. I've made candles for years. It's not the kind of job that gets you much attention, but I've always loved the quietness of it, the gentle flicker of flames, the soft glow they cast, and the smell of wax as it cools. My shop wasn't anything special, just a small, cluttered space in the corner of a street nobody ever really bothered to notice. I liked it that way. Until one day, something changed. It was late afternoon when a man walked into my shop. He looked out of place, wearing an old, tattered coat, despite the summer heat outside. His eyes were distant, glazed over as if he'd seen something that had taken part of his mind with it. He didn't say much, just handed me a bundle wrapped in cloth, muttered something in a language I didn't understand, and walked out before I could ask him any questions. I didn't think much of it at the time. People left me odd things all the time, strange requests for candles, peculiar orders that would make anyone else curious. But not me. I was used to the bizarre. When I unwrapped the cloth, a single wick tumbled out. It was longer than any I had seen, thin and delicate. The texture felt strange in my fingers, almost like silk, but with an odd, unnatural warmth to it. The color was off too, neither white nor cream, but something in between, like ash from a fire that never cooled. Something in my gut told me this wasn't any ordinary wick. But curiosity got the better of me. I cut the wick and fashioned a candle around it. Nothing fancy, just the usual wax and a simple mold. It took hours to set, and by the time it was ready, night had fallen. I lit it out of habit, not expecting much. But the moment the flame caught, the air in the room seemed to shift. The fire didn't burn the way it should have. The flame flickered, but not like the gentle glow I was used to. It danced wildly, casting sharp, twisting shadows across the walls. And then I heard it, a soft whisper, faint at first, barely noticeable, like the sound of wind through a crack in the door. I leaned in closer, trying to make sense of the sound. That's when I realized it wasn't just a random noise, it was a voice. The flame was whispering. The words were unlike anything I'd ever heard before, low, guttural, and foreign. It felt like the language itself was crawling under my skin, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't understand a single word, but something about the tone felt sinister. I should have put it out then. I should have snuffed the flame and thrown the wick out. But I didn't. I was too intrigued, too wrapped up in the mystery of it all. For days, I kept relighting the candle, hoping to understand the words better. The voice grew louder each time, more insistent, though still unintelligible. It was hypnotic, like a lullaby from some dark corner of the world. But then things started to get strange. At first it was small stuff, things I could brush off as coincidence. The windows would fog up, even though it wasn't cold outside. Shadows would move, twisting and curling along the walls in ways that didn't make sense. And every time I looked into the flame, I'd see something just out of the corner of my eye, something moving in the dark corners of the room, but never quite in focus. The worst part was the smell. At first, it was just the usual scent of burning wax. But over time, it changed, became acrid, like sulfur or something rotten, decaying. I tried using different wax, different molds, but no matter what I did, the smell stayed the same. One night, while I was working late, I noticed something on the counter next to the candle, a note. I don't know how it got there. I sure didn't write it. The paper was old, yellowed, and brittle. The words on it were written in the same language the flame whispered. But this time, I understood. It said, "Do not listen." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My eyes flicked to the candle. The flame was still burning, still whispering. But now it felt different. The voice was louder, almost shouting, and the words were clearer. They were calling to me, pulling me in. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the floor. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the flame. It flickered violently, casting grotesque shapes on the walls, shapes that seemed to writhe and twist as though they were alive. And then I saw it, something in the flame. At first, it looked like smoke, curling and swirling within the fire. But as I stared, the smoke took shape. A face. Hollow, sunken eyes stared back at me from within the fire. Its mouth moved, whispering the same strange words over and over again. I panicked. I reached for the nearest thing, a glass of water, and threw it at the candle. The flame sputtered and went out, but the voice didn't stop. It kept whispering, the words echoing in my head, louder and louder. I stumbled back, my body trembling. The room felt oppressive, the air thick and heavy. I couldn't breathe. I tried to calm myself down, to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. I didn't light the candle again after that. I couldn't, but that didn't stop the whispers. They'd followed me everywhere, in my shop, in my home, even in my dreams. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the voice still murmuring in my ear. I tried everything, burning the wick, throwing it out, even burying it far from the shop. But it always found its way back to me. I wasn't alone anymore. The face in the flame, it was always there, watching, waiting. I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? A candle maker driven mad by a wick that wouldn't burn out. They'd think I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. Then one night, the voice spoke to me in a language I understood. Let me in. The words were clear, sharp. They cut through the fog in my mind like a knife. My hands trembled as I stared at the unlit candle on my workbench. I knew what it wanted. I knew what would happen if I lit it again. But I was tired. Tired of the whispers, tired of the shadows that haunted me, tired of the face that lingered in the corners of my vision. I just wanted it to stop. So I lit the candle one last time. The flame roared to life, higher and brighter than ever before. The voice filled the room, no longer a whisper, but a deafening shout, the words pouring over me like a wave. The face in the flame grinned, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. And then everything went dark. When they found me, I was still sitting at my workbench, the candle burned down to a stub. They said I looked peaceful, as if I had just fallen asleep. But they didn't know. They couldn't hear the voice that still echoed in my head, whispering in that strange, terrible language. Because even in the silence, the flame never goes out. I've been a park ranger for nearly 15 years now. There's something special about working in the woods, being surrounded by towering trees and endless trails. I've always believed that I knew every corner of this place, every plant, every animal, every sound that echoed through the forest. But that was before the reports started coming in. It was late summer when I first got word of it. A hiker, breathless and wide-eyed, had rushed into the station claiming they'd heard something strange. They couldn't describe it exactly, but they swore it wasn't any animal they'd ever come across. As a ranger, I'm used to people getting spooked by the usual critters out here. The coyotes, the owls, sometimes even the wind. But something about the look in that hiker's eyes stuck with me. They were genuinely shaken. At first, I brushed it off as an overreaction. The woods can play tricks on people, especially when they're alone. But then another report came in, and then another. Each person described the same thing, a strange, guttural cry that echoed from all directions, like the forest itself was crying out. They couldn't pinpoint where it came from, only that it seemed to surround them. Curiosity got the better of me after the third report. That night, I grabbed my flashlight, radio, and some gear and decided to check it out for myself. If there was something out there, I figured I'd be the one to find it. I've seen it all. Black bears, mountain lions, even the occasional wolf. There wasn't much that could surprise me anymore. Also, I thought. I set out at dusk, the sky a dull orange behind the canopy of trees. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I'd expected the usual chirping of crickets, maybe the distant hoot of an owl, but there was nothing. Just my footsteps crunching against the dirt path and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was eerie, but I pushed it aside, convincing myself it was just another night in the forest. About an hour into my walk, I stopped by an old clearing that the locals called Echo Hollow. It's a place known for its odd acoustics. Sounds seem to bounce around endlessly. If there was a cry, I figured I'd hear it here. But for a long while, all I got was silence. And then it came. At first it was faint, like a distant wail, barely noticeable. But as I strained to listen, it grew louder, more distinct. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, almost like the screech of a bird, but much deeper, more guttural, as though something was trying to scream through a throat not made for it. The sound was everywhere at once, bouncing off the trees, echoing from every direction. I spun around, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it was useless. It was as if the entire forest was alive, crying out. My heart started to pound in my chest. I wasn't scared, not yet, but I was definitely unsettled. I'd never heard anything like it, and the fact that I couldn't locate its source made it even worse. I stood there frozen, listening as the cry echoed around me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. Complete and utter silence. I turned on my radio to report what I'd heard, but the signal was fuzzy, crackling with static. I couldn't get through. That's when I decided to head back, but as I retraced my steps, the forest didn't feel right anymore. The air was colder, and the trees seemed to close in around me. I could still hear that cry in the back of my mind, replaying over and over again, as if it had imprinted itself on my brain. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it, the cry, the echo, the way it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I tried to shake it off, but the next morning, I got another report. This time, it wasn't just the cry they heard. The person had seen something, a shadowy figure darting between the trees, too fast to be anything human, too large to be any animal they recognized. I knew I had to go back. There was something out there, something I couldn't explain, and I needed to find it. So the next night, I went deeper into the woods, past Echo Hollow, and into the less traveled areas of the park. The air grew thicker as I walked, and the trees seemed to tower even higher, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground. It was around midnight when I heard it again. The cry. Only this time, it was louder, more urgent. It wasn't just one sound, though. It was as if the forest was alive with voices, all crying out at once. I stood still, my heart racing, straining my eyes to catch a glimpse of whatever was making that noise. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something darting between the trees, too fast for me to make out. I raised my flashlight, scanning the area, but there was nothing. Just darkness and the endless echo of that cry. I pressed on, determined to find the source, but the deeper I went, the worse it got. The cries grew louder, more chaotic, until they were all I could hear. It felt like the forest was closing in on me, like I was being watched, followed. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I kept going. And then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch out in every direction. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, like two distant stars. And its mouth was wide open, releasing that horrible, gut-wrenching cry that had haunted me for days. I froze, my mind racing. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there watching me, its cry echoing through the trees. And then it was gone. Just like that, it vanished into the shadows, leaving me standing there, trembling, the echoes of its cry still ringing in my ears. I ran. I don't even remember how I made it back to the station, but I ran faster than I ever had before. When I'd burst through the door, breathless and wide-eyed, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't an animal. It wasn't something that belonged in this world. I never went back to that part of the forest again. I couldn't. The reports kept coming in, more and more people hearing the cries, some even claiming they'd seen the figure too. But no one ever found it. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear it. The cry. It echoes in my mind, bouncing off the walls of my skull, just like it did in the forest. I don't know what it was, or why it came, but I know one thing for sure. It's still out there, and it's waiting. I never thought that rearranging furniture could mess with my head. But I'll be honest, I've never dealt with a house like this before. As an interior designer, I've worked in plenty of homes, some with great energy and others that felt a little off. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for this. It all started when I got a call from a client, a young couple named Sarah and Ethan. They had just bought this old Victorian-style house at the edge of town. The kind of house that creaked and groaned in the wind, standing tall like it had its own secrets. They wanted to restore it, make it livable again. Just a bit of rearranging, Sarah had said on the phone. We want to keep the charm, but we also want it to feel more comfortable. Comfortable. That word haunted me for some reason, because when I arrived, the house felt anything but. The first thing I noticed as I stepped through the door was the air. It was thick, as if the walls were breathing, slowly closing in and then expanding. I chalked it up to old wood settling, but there was something else. Something I couldn't quite place. The couple, though, seemed unfazed, eagerly showing me around. This is the living room, Ethan said, gesturing to the massive space with its high ceilings and cracked wallpaper. We thought maybe moving the sofa over by the fireplace would open things up. I nodded, already mentally rearranging the space. I've always had a knack for picturing the perfect layout, and this room was no exception. The fireplace was a focal point, but the furniture felt scattered, lost in the vastness of the room. Easy fix, I thought. I spent the next few hours shifting things around, moving the couch here, placing the armchairs there, bringing in a new coffee table. I stepped back, satisfied with my work. The room felt more balanced, cozy even. But as I admired the changes, I noticed something odd. The walls, had they shifted? No, that's impossible. I shook off the feeling and called Sarah and Ethan in to take a look. They loved it, of course. It feels so much better already, Sarah gushed. More welcoming. I smiled, but inside, I felt a little uneasy. Something about the space wasn't right, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. So I packed up my things and left, promising to come back the next day to tackle the dining room. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the walls. The way they seemed to shift, almost like they were breathing. I convinced myself I was just tired, too much work, not enough sleep. But when I returned the next morning, things got stranger. The moment I walked back into the living room, it felt smaller. Not drastically, but enough that I noticed. The furniture seemed closer together, like the space had shrunk overnight. I stood there for a minute frozen. The walls couldn't have moved. Could they? Everything all right? Ethan's voice snapped me out of my thoughts. Yeah, I said, shaking my head. Just thinking about the dining room. Let's get started. But as we moved through the house, that eerie feeling followed me. Every room I touched, every piece of furniture I shifted, the walls seemed to close in just a little more. It was subtle at first, just a few inches, but by the time I finished the third room, it was undeniable. The rooms were getting smaller. I think we should stop for today, I suggested, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Sarah frowned. But you've only done half the house. I just need to check a few things, I mumbled, backing out of the room. I didn't want to freak them out, but I needed to know if I was losing my mind. I started measuring. Every room, every hallway. I measured the dimensions, comparing them to the blueprints Sarah had given me. And every single room was smaller than it had been the day before. Not by much, just an inch here, half an inch there, but enough to make me dizzy. I didn't tell Sarah or Ethan. Instead, I told myself I was overthinking it. The house was old, maybe it was settling. Maybe the shifting was normal. But that night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the strange shifts, the feeling of being trapped, like the walls were closing in around me. The next morning, I arrived early, before Sarah and Ethan were up. I had to see if the house had changed again overnight. And sure enough, it had. The rooms were even smaller now, so cramped it felt like the house was slowly suffocating itself. I couldn't breathe. I had to get out of there. But just as I turned to leave, I heard a creak behind me. I froze, heart pounding. Slowly, I turned around. The walls were moving. I swear, they were shifting, inching toward me, like they were alive. Panic surged through me, and I ran straight out the door into the cold morning air. I didn't go back. I couldn't. I called Sarah later that day, made up some excuse about being sick, and promised to reschedule. But I never did. I was too afraid of what I'd see if I stepped back into that house. Weeks passed, and I tried to move on, but the nightmares didn't stop. Every night, I dreamed of those walls, slowly closing in, trapping me inside. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. And then, one day, Sarah called me. "Something's wrong with the house," she whispered, her voice trembling. The rooms, they're smaller. We can barely move in the living room now. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain it to her when I didn't understand it myself? You need to leave, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Get out of the house. But it was too late. A few days later, I saw the news. Sarah and Ethan were dead. They'd been found in the house, crushed under debris. The walls had caved in on them, trapping them inside. But that wasn't the worst part. The police report said there were no signs of structural damage. No cracks, no faults in the foundation. Nothing to explain why the walls had collapsed. It was like the house had swallowed them whole. I'm writing this now because I need someone to know what happened. I don't care if you believe me or not. I just need to get it off my chest. I've stopped working as a designer. I can't go into houses anymore, not after what I've seen. Every time I step into a room, I feel like the walls are closing in. Like they're watching me, waiting for the right moment to trap me inside. Sometimes I wonder if the house is still out there, waiting for its next victim. Maybe it's already found one. All I know is I'm never going near it again. And neither should you.